Under the heavy, humid air of southern Louisiana, Marcus Hill's tin toy boat was still warm in his hand when the 7-year-old boy vanished from the wooden house near Bayou Lafourche, a town of just over 8,000 people. It was a windless summer night, where the chirping of crickets and the lapping of water against the swampy banks blended into the familiar lullaby of the town. At 9:07 p.m., the Hill family's neighbor, Claudette Broussard, waved through her kitchen window as she saw Marcus run past the backyard, his white t-shirt standing out against the dappled darkness of the yard. The boy appeared to just be taking his toy inside the kitchen, an ordinary sight Mrs. Broussard had grown used to over the years. She watched his silhouette disappear behind the back door, and that moment became the last time Marcus Hill was ever seen alive. What happened in the next 20 minutes would haunt Donaldsonville for 58 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. That summer night in 1967 in Donaldsonville passed under the thick, humid air typical of southern Louisiana, as the Hill family returned to their small wooden house on the edge of Bayou Lafourche after the St. Francis Church Festival. The buzzing of insects formed an endless carpet of sound. The smell of water and mud rose from the bayou, mixing with the oppressive dampness that clung to the skin. Far off, the steady thrum of a night boat's engine echoed, gradually fading into the darkness of the reed-covered banks. Marcus, the 7-year-old boy with lightly curly brown hair, ran ahead into the house, clutching the tin toy boat he had carried all day from the festival, as if it were his lucky charm for the long day. Charles and Lorraine Hill stood on the wooden porch, gently setting down bags of leftover food and picnic blankets, still smelling of BBQ smoke. 3-year-old Emily, fast asleep on Lorraine's shoulder, breathed evenly, completely unaware that the night outside was changing color. In the final moment, Lorraine saw her son. Marcus was standing at the back door, one hand on the weathered wooden frame, half his body already swallowed by the kitchen's soft darkness. He turned back and asked his mother a small fleeting question, "Mom, where should I put the boat?" Lorraine smiled and called back, "Anywhere is fine, honey." Marcus nodded and disappeared into the gentle darkness of the house. 5 minutes passed. Lorraine still thought he might be putting the toy away or getting a drink of water. 10 minutes. Charles paused what he was doing, glanced inside the house, but heard no footsteps or the familiar chatter of the boy. 20 minutes. Lorraine called into the kitchen, the bedrooms, the hallway. "Marcus, where are you?" Only a thick silence answered, a silence so complete, it turned initial worry into an ice-cold panic. The back door stood slightly ajar. A sudden gust from the swamp slammed it hard, as if someone had shoved it. The porch light flickered, casting Charles's long shadow across the wet ground. The air grew taut as a wire. Every one of Lorraine's senses screamed that something was wrong, that this unease was not the kind caused by a child wandering the yard. Charles grabbed a flashlight and bolted outside, sweeping the beam across the grass, under the old oak trees, down the path to the water's edge. "Marcus, where are you?" Only the steady croaking of frogs from the bayou answered, like an indifferent soundtrack to the terror gripping the couple. Lorraine clutched her chest, gasping, then burst into tears as the worst thought flashed through her mind. Charles ran to the neighbors' houses, pounding on doors, asking if anyone had seen Marcus leave the yard, but every answer was the same. No one had seen anything. Not a soul, not a single unusual sound. Everything seemed swallowed by the darkness. Back on the porch, Charles looked at Lorraine, her panicked eyes mirroring what both were afraid to say aloud. He picked up the wall-mounted phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Lorraine stood beside him, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the receiver when the call was transferred to the duty officer. A short, suffocating pause. Then Lorraine spoke, her voice hoarse and trembling, but chillingly clear. "My son is gone." Police sirens cut through the stillness of Donaldsonville at 4 a.m., the only sound breaking the heavy quiet that had settled over the Hill family home. An Ascension Parish Sheriff's Office cruiser turned onto gravel road, leading to the bayou, its headlights sweeping across the pitch-black water before bouncing off the ancient oak trees, swaying in the swamp breeze. Deputies stepped out of the vehicle, Their low, urgent voices made Lorraine feel as if her legs might give out. Charles stood close beside his wife, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the back door still swaying gently in the damp wind. Deputies, Michael Landry and Curtis Navarro, were the first to enter the house. They asked Charles to turn on every light for inspection. The pale yellow glow from the incandescent bulbs made the space feel even more alien, too bright for a peaceful bayou night, yet far too quiet for the absence of a 7-year-old boy. They checked the living room, the hallway, then the kitchen, the last place Marcus had been seen. The kitchen was tidy, with the dish towel still neatly folded by the sink, and clean plates stacked on the rack. No signs of disturbance, nothing out of place, no chair pushed aside, no mud streaks or strange handprints. Everything was so perfectly in order it was almost unbelievable, as if the kitchen had been frozen the instant Marcus stepped inside. When they reached the back door, Deputy Navarro gently pushed it. It let out a small creak. The door had not been forced. The lock was intact. The hinges were unscratched. Navarro noted, no forced entry. In the backyard, they shone flashlights over the grass. Early Louisiana morning was still clung to the dew. Tiny water droplets on the blades reflected the light into hundreds of little sparks. They searched around the foundation, under the porch, then out to the fence. No clear footprints, no drag marks, no scrap of fabric, nothing of Marcus's left behind. The near-total emptiness of the yard left both deputies silent for a moment. There was no evidence anyone had broken in. No evidence Marcus had been dragged away, but also no evidence the boy had left on his own. That was what sent a chill down their spines. When Sheriff Raymond Thibodeau arrived, he stepped out of his car, adjusted the gun belt, and approached Charles and Lorraine with the calm of a man who had been doing the job nearly 30 years. But that calm was only surface. He knew exactly what this unnatural quiet at the scene meant. The kid might have wandered out into the yard, the sheriff said, trying to sound steady. We've seen plenty of cases like that. Kids get curious, especially on a cool night. Lorraine shook her head at once, eyes red. No, Marcus never goes far alone. He's afraid of the dark. He would never open the back door and go outside. Charles squeezed his wife's hand and added, if he had gone into the yard, he would have left footprints. But you guys aren't finding any, right? The sheriff paused for a second at the question. Right, nothing. And that nothing was the most terrifying part. We're not ruling anything out, the sheriff replied, then turned to the deputies. Call in the search teams, right now. Within 20 minutes, a second and third patrol car arrived, along with a pickup carrying halogen lights, handheld radios, and night search gear. 3 neighbors also crossed the yard, including old Mr. Jennings, who had lived here nearly 40 years, asking frantically if they had checked near the Bayou bank yet. The tide was going out tonight, he said quietly. Current strong. If he got close. Lorraine covered her ears, refusing to hear another word. The sheriff raised a hand. No speculation in front of the family. He turned to a young deputy. Start from the outer edge of the yard, expand a 200-meter radius, head toward the water first, the rest recheck around the back door. Charles stood in the middle of the yard, watching beams of light sweep through the darkness, his heart burning with urgency. Lorraine sat down hard on the porch steps, hands over her face, shaking violently. In the flickering lights, Donaldsonville looked like a town caught between two worlds, one side the peaceful South, the other something invisible that had quietly entered this house and taken their son. And right then, the sheriff spoke the official words that launched the search would last 58 years. We start now. Every minute counts. In the damp silence of the bayou, the first search for Marcus Hill began. Dawn came slowly to Donaldsonville, as if the sky itself was holding its breath along with the Hill family. The surface of Bayou Lafourche was still covered in a thin, milky layer of fog, giving off the warm smell of mud mixed with water vapor. The search team's airboats sat motionless on the water like sleeping creatures. The entire area carried a strange feeling, so quiet that every footstep of the officers echoed like a drum. Sheriff Thibodeau stood in the middle of the yard, hand on the brim of his hat, studying the ground as if trying to read something from the dew-covered grass. He had seen many missing persons cases before, but the complete lack of trace in this one unsettled him more than any other. No footprints, no dropped items, no cries, no neighbor heard a thing. It was as if the boy had been lifted straight off the ground. The only thing left was emptiness. And in his line of work, emptiness was sometimes more frightening than any evidence. "All right," he said, voice low. "Expand the search grid, 1 mile in all 4 directions. Prioritize the bayou bank." The younger deputies nodded and quickly split into teams of 3. They carried high-powered flashlights, radios, topo maps, and marking stakes. One team headed toward the dirt track to the boat landing, another toward the eastern stand of oaks, the third straight down the soft grass to the water's edge. Charles Hill asked to join, but the sheriff held him back. "We need you here. If Marcus comes back, he'll come home first." Lorraine leaned against the porch post, her whole body shaking in waves at those words. If Marcus comes back, the phrase cut like a knife. It held both hope and chest-tightening fear. The sun peaked above the horizon, throwing the first streaks of light across the grass, making the dew sparkle. From a distance a deputy shouted, "Sheriff, got something." The sheriff ran over. It was the team sweeping the tall grass near the western fence. A deputy named Harper was crouched down, gloved hand carefully picking up a small metal object. "Looks like part of a kid's toy," Harper said. The sheriff bent down. It was a thin piece of bent metal, appeared to have once been part of a small tin boat, but one edge was heavily scratched, as if it had struck rock or been stepped on. Harper said, "Could be the kids, could be nothing." Lorraine heard from afar and started toward the group, but Charles held her arm. "Let them work," he whispered. The sheriff turned the piece of tin over in the morning light. No engraving, no distinctive paint, nothing to confirm it belonged to Marcus. It could have been an old toy from any child who had played in the area over the years. It could have been lying there for weeks, months, or it could have fallen just hours ago. Every possibility was open, and that didn't bring them any closer. "Bag it as evidence," the sheriff ordered. "Log the location, mark the area, and keep searching." The team continued combing every clump of grass, every tree hollow, every patch of soft dirt for indentations. Just minutes later, another deputy, Ramsey, called out, "Sheriff, I've got something." The sheriff ran over. Ramsey was holding a small white scrap of fabric. It was frayed at the edges, as if torn from clothing caught on something. Lorraine stared from a distance, eyes wide. "Is that?" "No," the sheriff answered gently. "Marcus was wearing a light blue shirt and khaki shorts last night. This doesn't match." But what caught the sheriff's attention wasn't the color, it was the location. The scrap lay about 6 yards from the piece of tin, near the tall grass leading to a seldom-used trail. 2 unrelated clues appearing close together was unusual, or it could just be coincidence. In Louisiana, strong bayou winds could blow objects anywhere. Still, the coincidence made the whole team feel as if they had just heard the first whisper from a case that had been silent far too long. Harper said quietly, almost afraid to break the atmosphere, "We expanding the radius again." The sheriff nodded, eyes never leaving the spot where the 2 items were found. 3 miles now, and call in more teams. We need more bodies." Radios crackled, the deputies reported ready. The airboats fired up, engines throbbing powerfully, sending ripples across the water. Charles stepped closer to the sheriff. "Did you find something?" The sheriff looked at him, eyes deep and heavy. "Not enough to conclude anything, but enough that we can't ignore it. We'll keep looking." Lorraine stood behind her husband, hands over her face, stifling sobs. The tiny clues, a possible piece of toy, a scrap of cloth definitely not Marcus's, could mean absolutely nothing. Or they could be the first signs the boy had left the yard under circumstances no one wanted to consider. As the sun climbed higher, shining straight down on the swamp, and turning the fog into wisps of steam, the search teams fanned out in a widening arc, pushing deeper into the damp trails. And at that moment the sheriff spoke the words that closed the first morning. "Whether it's coincidence or real trace, we follow it to the end. Anything could be the key." The search for Marcus Hill, which had begun as a frantic circle around the yard, had officially grown into the largest operation Donaldsonville had ever seen. The search for Marcus Hill, which began as a family's panicked reaction in the night, quickly turned into an unprecedented operation in Ascension Parish history. Just hours after discovering the two vague clues, the piece of tin that might belong to the toy and the scrap of fabric of unknown origin, Sheriff Thibodeau activated every rescue resource the parish had. By 9 a.m., more than 200 people were on scene: police, rescue personnel, local hunters, church volunteer groups, the Hills neighbors, and airboat owners from as far as Paincourtville, who volunteered to take their boats into the dark waters of the bayou. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the dirt road to the Hill house, tires leaving long tracks in the thick Louisiana mud left by the night dew. No one spoke loudly, no one joked. The crowd was large, but subdued by a feeling everyone recognized: a 7-year-old boy could not vanish like this unless something far worse was happening. At the water's edge, 3 airboats started almost in unison. The roar of the giant fans sliced through the air, echoing across the bayou like the growl of a beast waking up. Large swirls spread behind each boat, dragging water hyacinths and rotten leaves. The airboat teams split into 2 directions. One group headed north to Donaldsonville Bridge, the other swept south along the gentle curve of Bayou Lafourche, all the way to Paincourtville, nearly 14 miles of waterway. The sheriff stood on the command boat, gripping the rail, eyes constantly scanning the water ahead. He knew that if someone had abducted Marcus, the water was the easiest escape route, faster than by road, quieter, and full of hidden turns only locals knew. Meanwhile on land, K-9 units from East Baton Rouge were rushed in. The Belgian Malinois trained for missing children were brought the shirt Marcus had worn, which Lorraine had kept in the laundry room. One dog sniffed deeply several times, circled, then took off running toward the patch of wild lavender behind the Hill house. Everyone following tensed like bowstrings. A scent trail meant Marcus had been out here, not far from the house, but the hope collapsed fast. Less than 5 minutes later, at the lavender, the Malinois stopped, circled a few times, then turned back, muzzle to the ground, unable to pick up the trail again. The handler repeated the process from the start. Same result: trail lost. The sheriff watched with a face like stone. The kid's scent ends here, or gets cut off here. In Louisiana, swamp mud and humidity could sometimes confuse tracking dogs, but a trail vanishing completely, as if the air itself had been sucked away, was something else. Along the dirt road to the bayou, a group of volunteers searched along the hill's old wooden fence. Mud sucked at their boots, mosquitoes swarmed with every step. They reached the corner where thick nettles grew, right by a narrow path into the western woods. A thin 60-year-old man wearing a fisherman's hat stepped forward and said, "Last night I saw a man standing right here by this fence." The sheriff immediately asked, "What time?" "Around 11 p.m. I think." He frowned, trying to remember. "I was driving home from my cousin's party. Saw someone standing here looking toward the hill yard. I thought it was Charles." The sheriff looked at Charles. Charles shook his head hard. "I didn't go out there last night. I only stayed on the porch and inside." "Did you see the man's face?" the sheriff asked. The man clicked his tongue. "No, too dark, but tall, taller than Charles probably." Lorraine, standing nearby, clutched her sleeves. A strange man by the fence, the very night Marcus disappeared, was something that could not be ignored. But within 5 minutes everything got messy. When Deputy Navarro took the statement and pressed for details, the man changed his story. "Wait, maybe it was 10 o'clock, or 9:30. I'm not sure, I'd had a few drinks." The sheriff stayed calm but his eyes grew colder. "You said you were driving home from the party last night. What time did you actually get home?" I think, around 8 p.m. maybe." "So how could you see someone at the fence at 11? The man was quiet for a few seconds, then answered, "Maybe I got the time wrong. I'm not even sure I saw anything now." His third version went in yet another direction. Could have just been the shadow of the power pole on the fence. It was dark, easy to mistake. Navarro glanced at his notebook. A witness who changed his story 3 times in under 10 minutes, from clearly seeing a man unsure of the time, maybe just a shadow. In child disappearance cases, an unreliable witness can be more dangerous than no witness at all. It can send police down the wrong path. But the sheriff still logged it. Any detail, no matter how tangled, could turn out to be the key. The search continued to spread. One group poked sticks into every inch of forest floor. Another probed the roadside brush. Calls of Marcus, Marcus, echoed through the trees into endless emptiness. From Paincourtville the boat teams radioed, nothing but abandoned fishing boats and gator tracks. Continuing south. In the hill yard, Lorraine knelt to pray for the 10th time without stopping, hands trembling, whispering, "Please someone bring my boy back." But hour after hour passed with no further evidence, no footprints, no torn clothing, no unusual sound reported by any neighbor that night. Only the two tiny clues, one possibly Marcus's, one definitely not, and one constantly shifting witness statement. By noon that day, the sheriff realized the bayou's silence was more terrifying than any cry for help could be. "Keep going," he said in a low voice, "and expand toward the cypress woods. Whoever took the kid can't stay vanished forever." But deep down he knew, the less evidence there was, the easier it was to put a name to this kidnapping. The search continued, but Donaldsonville began to feel a greater fear coiling, waiting to explode. Dawn, on the second day after Marcus disappeared, brought a heavy atmosphere, as if Donaldsonville had just woken up with a wound that hadn't yet taken shape. The search involving 200 people was still ongoing along the bayou and nearby forests, but Sheriff Raymond Thibodeau knew that local forces alone weren't enough. The child had been missing for nearly 24 hours, no footprints, no reliable witnesses, no belongings of the victim, except for the uncertain piece of tin. A moment of vanishing into the darkness, and that was exactly the type of case with the lowest survival rate in the statistics he had studied. At 8:14 a.m., the sheriff officially contacted the FBI New Orleans field office, not just to ask for assistance, but to activate the federal protocol for non-family child abduction cases, the disappearances of children, where the likelihood of being taken by a stranger was the greatest. Within 2 hours, the first 2 FBI agents arrived in Donaldsonville, Special Agent Walter Hanford and Special Agent Linda Reyes, from the early days of the Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Card Team. They stepped out of the black sedan, carrying briefcases, specialized radio equipment, and the cold, solemn air of people who had seen too many similar cases end in the worst way. When Lorraine and Charles saw the FBI letters on their jackets, both froze on the porch. Lorraine whispered, "Oh God, has it come to this?" The sheriff replied softly, avoiding her gaze, "We have to consider all possibilities." Agent Hanford shook hands with the sheriff and got straight to the point, no beating around the bush. "Do you think this is a child wandering case or abduction?" The sheriff glanced at the house, the backyard, then the grass where the piece of tin was found. He spoke slowly, as if forcing each word out. "If it was a child wandering, we would have found footprints, or clothing, or anything. But there's nothing," as if the boy evaporated. Agent Reyes took notes quickly, then continued, "This case fits non-family kidnapping more than a lost child." That phrase, non-family kidnapping, made Lorraine choke. It was the conclusion she feared most. A stranger who came in the night, made no sound, left no trace, and took their son. When the FBI used that term in an investigation, they were often right. But it was also at that moment that Reyes flipped to a new page in her file, and spoke the most important words of the morning. "But we have no signs of a perpetrator, no suspicious vehicles, no suspicious persons, no clear motive." That made this case not just terrifying, but also unusual. The FBI divided the case into 3 main investigative directions, mirroring the methods they used throughout the 60s, 70s in child disappearance cases. 1. Family investigation, looking for internal motives. 2. Neighbor investigation, looking for who had opportunity to access Marcus. 3. Community investigation, St. Francis Parish, school, people who appeared at the festival night. Reyes said bluntly, 90% of child disappearances involve someone known. We need to rule that out before expanding outside the community. Charles looked straight at her, No one in my house did anything to Marcus. No one. I know, Reyes said gently, but we have to be sure. The FBI entered the Hill house like entering a major crime scene. Every room, every item, every speck of dust examined closely with specialized lights. No signs of struggle, no signs of dragging, no overturned objects, no blood, no strange shoe prints. The only thing they noticed was perfection. An unnatural perfection. A house where every edge remained intact, as if the darkness had sneaked in to take Marcus, without disturbing a single thing. Hanford muttered, "If someone got in here, he must be a ghost." And the yard? Once again, the FBI swept every meter of ground more professionally, analyzing grass indentations, faint drag marks, fibers caught on branches, but the result was the same as the local search team. Nothing. No adult footprints, Reyes said. No child footprints. Charles clenched his fists, speaking through gritted teeth. Marcus couldn't have walked out of the house without leaving footprints. The FBI agreed, and that was the problem. Next step: family investigation. The FBI interviewed Lorraine for 2 straight hours, about marriage, finances, mental health, family conflicts, debts, custody disputes. All none. They interviewed Charles, checking work schedule, relationships, recent behavior. No abnormalities. They interviewed nearby relatives. No one had bad motives. In other words, the Hill family had no reason to harm Marcus. The FBI moved to the second direction: neighbors. Neighbor Jennings, the one who gave the 3 times changing statement, was asked the most questions. At the sheriff's office, he sat with arms crossed, voice hoarse from fatigue. I just saw a shadow. Not sure it was a person. How much alcohol did you drink that night? I don't remember. What time did you leave the party? I could be 8, 9, 10 o'clock. I don't remember clearly. Reyes tilted her head, asking the key question: do you know Marcus? Yes, nice kid, but I didn't know him well enough to interfere in anything. Have you ever approached him? No. Jennings' awkwardness made his statement worthless, but not enough to consider him suspicious. A drunk man seeing a shadow on a Louisiana night wasn't uncommon. They continued to the Parker house, LeBlanc, Savoy, all of whom were at the church festival the night before, and none remembered seeing anything unusual. No one heard screams, no one heard struggles, no one saw car lights turn on in the night, no one saw strange cars passing by. A woman at the end of the road said, "If anyone drove in here, my dog would have barked. I didn't hear it bark at all." Reyes noted, no suspicious vehicles, no movement, no sounds. The case increasingly resembled a paradox. Marcus couldn't have vanished on his own, but no one else had entered the area, and that was why the FBI began considering the scenario the sheriff had feared from the start: an abductor who had observed the Hill family beforehand, someone who knew their schedule, someone who knew that night Marcus would step into the dark kitchen alone. Hanford crossed his arms, looking at the Hill yard diagram. If we're facing a non-family abductor, he's the most dangerous type, the kind who can take a child without leaving a trace. Reyes added, and that type doesn't stop after one victim. But the biggest problem was, where was the perpetrator? No security cameras in 1967, no physical evidence, no reliable witnesses, no strange cars, no footprints, no tire marks, no hair, no fingerprints, no sounds, no motive, nothing. A perfect void, too perfect. By mid-afternoon, the FBI New Orleans confirmed what the sheriff had sensed from the morning. This isn't a wandering child, this is an abduction. But the more haunting question still had no answer. Abduction, by whom, how, and why Marcus Hill? The investigation had just opened, and had already become a maze, and all paths led to one single reality: the perpetrator had come in the night, like a walking darkness, and knew how to leave the scene without leaving a single trace. Someone like that wasn't just passing through Donaldsonville by chance. He had a purpose, he had a plan, and he might not have gone far. The hunt officially began, even though they didn't know who they were hunting. As soon as the FBI concluded this could be an abduction by a stranger, heavy pressure fell over all of Donaldsonville. With no traces, no motive, no suspicious vehicle recorded, The community naturally turned to finding someone who could do that among the people they knew, or thought they knew. And the first name to spread throughout the town within 48 hours, Raymond Coulter. In a place where everyone knew everyone, Coulter was the name that always made people lower their voices when mentioning. He lived alone in a house about half a mile from the Hill House, right on the edge of the cypress forest, a former mechanic laid off, little communication, often out at night, and especially, known for not liking children. Many mothers in Donaldsonville had said they felt uneasy, seeing Coulter leaning on the fence watching children play in the churchyard, but all that was just rumors, no evidence, until Marcus disappeared. Suddenly, those rumors turned into tense whispers. If anyone did it, it's definitely Coulter. Sheriff Thibodeau and the FBI couldn't rely on public speculation, but Coulter still became the first suspect for two specific reasons. 1. Coulter often passed the dirt road behind the Hill House in the evenings. 2. He had no alibi for the time Marcus vanished. When invited to the sheriff's office, Coulter walked into the room with his habitual scowl, wearing a frayed baseball cap and looking around as if everyone was blaming him. "I don't know the Hill kid," he said right as he sat down. "I've never set foot in their yard." But Hanford wanted to check more thoroughly. "Where were you that night?" Coulter blinked twice, then answered, "At home, alone, no witnesses, no alibi, no one to confirm," and that was why he was suspected more. Within hours, rumors spread throughout Donaldsonville. The police got the guy, but the reality was far different. The FBI had just begun. They requested Coulter take a polygraph. First polygraph session, complete failure. The lie detector room was in a small space, with the hum of the air conditioner and flickering neon lights. Coulter sat down, hands on his knees, eyes staring at the table as if he believed silence would protect him. The operator asked each question evenly. "Did you abduct Marcus Hill?" "No." "Did you enter their yard that night?" "No." "Do you know where Marcus is?" "No." The indicators rising, spiking sharply, erratic fluctuations. Result: fail. The sheriff looked at the chart, frowning. Lorraine burst into tears upon hearing the summary, but Hanford crossed his arms again, not rushing to conclude. "Polygraph isn't evidence," he said. "Innocent people fail too, but the community didn't think like the FBI. They only heard one thing: Coulter lied." Coulter's house was scrutinized. Neighbors looked at him with suspicious eyes. Some men discussed that if the police didn't arrest Coulter, they would do it themselves. The sheriff had to send deputies to patrol around Coulter's house to prevent civilian violence. Second polygraph session, completely surprising opposite. The FBI wanted certainty, so requested a redo. This time same questions, same equipment, same process. But one change: new technician. Coulter sat down, sighing as if too tired of this witch hunt. When asked the exact same questions again, the polygraph gave completely opposite results. Pass, 100%. The machine recorded steady heart rate, even breathing, no indicator jumps. In just one night, Coulter went from abductor to seems innocent. The sheriff nearly lost his temper at this contradiction. How is that possible? A person can't commit a crime and be this calm. Reyes flipped through all the report pages, trying to find something unusual. Then the twist came. The sickened technician knew Coulter from 20 years ago during routine background checks on personnel. The FBI discovered something shocking. The person in charge of the second polygraph had been Coulter's old neighbor more than 20 years ago in Napoleonville. They had worked together at an old machine shop, drank beer together. Even more noteworthy, the technician hadn't reported this to the FBI before the test. When Hanford asked him to explain, the technician only said, "I didn't think it affected anything. I forgot. It's been so long." But the FBI didn't believe in forgot. Polygraphs were already controversial. Adding personal acquaintance, the results were completely worthless. Both tests were marked unusable. Conclusion: polygraph couldn't prove anything in Coulter's case. Instead of considering him more suspicious, the FBI had to return him to square one, an eccentric man with a troubled past, but no evidence linking him to the disappearance. Coulter was cleared from official suspicion, not because he was innocent, but because there was nothing to prove he was guilty. When the sheriff announced that in a small press conference, the Donaldsonville community exploded. If not him, then who? If no evidence, it means he's slick. What are the feds doing? But Lorraine Hill just stayed silent, not because she thought Coulter was innocent, but because this case gave her a more chilling feeling. If Coulter wasn't the perpetrator, then the real perpetrator was even more dangerous, more secretive, and somewhere right in this community, or had passed through here, leaving not a single trace. And Marcus Hill's disappearance officially moved to a new level. The abductor wasn't just good at hiding, he was so good that every investigative direction slipped off him like water through fingers. A type of perpetrator the FBI had once called by a very terrifying name, the ghost taker. The investigation was far from over, but this was the first turning point, and it only made the case darker than ever. The following days dragged on as if time itself was mired in the mud of Bayou Lafourche, heavy, slow, and mixed with the smell of fear. After Raymond Coulter was cleared from suspicion, the Marcus Hill case fell into the most terrifying void in any investigation. No suspects, no leads, no progress, and worse, faith began to shatter, even among those who wanted to believe the most. The search continued for many days, though the number of participants gradually decreased as the community's hope wore thin. The damp cypress forests continued to be combed, airboats still swept the water surface, tree hollows, abandoned wooden bridges, dense riverbanks, places everyone feared finding what they dared not say aloud. But on the 8th day, just after the rain, when the muddy ground was still steaming hot, terrible news reached Donaldsonville. A child's body was discovered south of Baton Rouge. The news spread like lightning. No one dared say it outright, but everyone thought the same thing. Lorraine Hill, upon hearing it, collapsed into a chair, hands covering her face, breath ragged. Charles just stood still, hands gripping the table edge, until his knuckles turned white. The FBI asked the family not to move, to wait for them to verify. Hanford and Reyes immediately went to the scene, bringing Marcus's detailed description: height, small scar on left knee, mole behind ear. 2 hours, then 3 hours, then 5 hours passed. Donaldsonville nearly held its breath. Finally, at 6:12 p.m., the Hill house phone rang. Reyes called. "It's not Marcus." Lorraine burst into tears, but not tears of relief, rather the sobs of a mother who understood that hope was only half returned. That child wasn't Marcus, but someone else had truly lost their child, and that proved something even more terrifying. Louisiana wasn't safe for children in the summer of 1967. The case was no longer an accident or a lost child. Another child had died, and that made everyone start seeing Marcus as the next name in a chain they didn't know the beginning or end of. 3 days after the Baton Rouge event, Lorraine received an envelope with no sender. Scribbled handwriting, smeared ink, wrinkled paper, as if someone had crumpled and straightened it. Inside was just one line: "He is still close." No signature, no ransom demand, no direct threat, just 4 words. But those 4 words were enough to make Lorraine scream in despair until the neighbors had to run over. Charles read it 3 times, 5 times, then set it on the table like a poisonous snake. Sheriff Thibodeau was called immediately, bringing the FBI. Hanford asked everyone to keep distance, wear gloves, and bagged the envelope as evidence. Reyes said right away, voice cold as ice, "Letters like this 90% come from people who like to disrupt investigations, or want to torment the family mentally." "What about the other 10%? Charles asked, eyes bloodshot. Reyes looked at him for a long time. "The other 10% is someone truly involved. Preliminary analysis showed no clear fingerprints, cheap printing ink, type sold at general stores, recycled paper, common throughout Louisiana, no useful DNA, nothing led to anyone." But the letter's content was more chilling than any technical detail. "He is still close." That could mean: 1. Marcus is still alive and near the town. 2. The abductor is lurking in the community. 3. The letter writer just wants to sow terror. But Lorraine believed the first, not because of logic, but because a mother's heart never lets go of any sliver of hope, no matter how fragile, to the point of irrationality. As for Charles, he began to fear the second that the perpetrator hadn't left, that he could be the person living right across the fence, or the person standing near them at church, or the anonymous passerby on the dirt road the night Marcus disappeared. From the day the letter appeared, Lorraine didn't dare go into the yard alone. Emily wasn't allowed out of her parents' sight for even a second. Charles nailed 2 more locks onto the back door. Neighbors who were once friendly now looked at each other with strange, wary eyes, because anyone could be the one who sent that letter. The sheriff watched everything slip gradually out of control. He met with the FBI in the Hill living room, speaking in a voice taut as steel wire. "We've searched the forests, we've searched underwater. Now perhaps we have to start searching right in this community." Hanford nodded. This letter could be a confession, or a threat. But either way, it proves one thing: someone is watching the Hill family. And that was the exact moment the FBI realized this was no longer a simple missing child case. It was a psychological game, a hunt where the hunter, not the police, was leading. And that fear, along with the 4 words written on the paper, began to split Donaldsonville in two, half in despair and half suspicious of one another. Even so, the search continued, but with one thing no one said out loud. With each passing day, the belief that Marcus was still alive grew smaller, like a light at the end of the tunnel slowly going out. And that letter was only the beginning of a series of strange, haunting signals from someone they still couldn't name. The 1970s rolled in like a thick fog, covering all of Donaldsonville and the disappearance of Marcus Hill. The clamor, the massive searches, the airboats sweeping the bayou day and night, everything gradually faded, slowed, then turned into whispered stories on porches at dusk. Time is always the greatest enemy of missing children, and by 1971, after 4 years with no new leads, the Marcus Hill case officially entered the phase the FBI called by its coldest name: inactive, pending new evidence. To the community, that meant this was now a cold case. Sheriff Thibodeau, who had lived on this case for years, suddenly looked far older than his age. The Hill house lived as if a shadow followed them. Lorraine aged a decade in just a few summers. Emily grew up in the shadow of a brother never found, while Charles began drinking at night, something he never touched before the 1967 tragedy. The file was slowly closed, the most terrifying kind of silence. Not everyone was willing to give up, but when there was no evidence, no new witnesses, no confession, no body, police were forced to shift resources to newer cases. The FBI investigation was reduced to 1 agent reviewing the file quarterly. The local sheriff's office kept only 1 deputy rereading the file at year's end to make sure nothing was missed. But no matter how many times they read it, they were reading emptiness. The crime scene map, photos of the Hill yard, the location where the piece of tin was found, everything stayed in a box labeled in red: Hill Marcus, missing, possible abduction, 1967. But the more people read, the more something felt wrong. Not about the case itself, but about how the file had been handled. 1975, an internal bombshell. A deputy took money to overlook details. The scandal broke while Donaldsonville was still mired in the grim decade of unemployment and moonshine. Deputy Arthur Gaspard, one of the original 1967 searchers, was discovered to have accepted cash from an anonymous donor to omit certain details from the night of the disappearance. The sheriff launched an internal investigation. The FBI was called in. First question: what details did he leave out? Gaspard stayed silent for 48 hours, then finally stammered in the interview room. "The person told me not to put the sound in the report." Hanford, now the new federal case lead, pressed what sound. Gaspard swallowed hard, eyes looking away. "A child crying, near the bayou area." The first night, the entire room froze. A child crying, heard the very night Marcus vanished, had never been entered into any official report. Reyes flipped frantically through the files. "This detail is in none of the 1967 reports." Gaspard hung his head. "I hate to say it, but someone paid me not to include it."
Who?
Gaspard shook his head. "A man I never clearly saw. Cash. Told me to let it go." said the sound wasn't related. The sheriff was so furious he had to leave the room for several minutes. No one had the right to make evidence in a missing child case disappear. Gaspard was fired immediately, but the damage was already done. The single most important piece of information from the first night, a child crying near the bayou, was absent from every official record, and the question that haunted the FBI for years afterward wasn't, why did Gaspard hide it? It was, who wanted that cry erased from the investigation's history? Re-examining the files, the notebook page completely gone. When the FBI demanded the original 1967 deputy notepads, they discovered something even more chilling than Gaspard's confession. That year's notepad had 47 pages, but page 12, the page marked as the first on-scene notes in the woods, was torn out clean, not naturally torn, not rotted by time, torn, with a perfectly straight edge, as if by knife or scissors. Page 13 referred to orders to search for additional evidence after hearing a suspicious sound, but the page describing the sound itself was gone. Hanford stood motionless in the evidence room, file in hand, yellow light shining on the razor-straight tier. Reyes could only say 2 words. Someone got in here. Only 4 people had keys to the evidence vault at that time: Sheriff Thibodeau, the undersheriff, the evidence custodian, and Deputy Gaspard, the one just fired. But Gaspard insisted, "I never went back to the vault after 1968. The FBI believed him. His prints didn't match those on the vault door. So who got in? Who tore out the page? And more importantly, why erase the detail of a child's cry, the cry that could have been Marcus, from investigative history? Cold case, but not forgotten." By the late 1970s, the Marcus Hill file was officially closed, to be reopened only upon new developments. But in the community, the case never truly slept. Sunday evening whispers, they say someone heard a child crying the night Marcus disappeared. That sound was near the bayou, toward Coulter's place, or the woods. That torn-out page, someone was hiding something. Some believed Marcus died that very night. Others believed he was taken far away. A few vaguely mentioned a night-running boat, never confirmed. Lorraine never forgot the wind. She believed that night the bayou wind carried something they failed to hear in time. Charles believed something else. If there was a cry, the boy was still alive then, and someone didn't want us to know. A cold case is not an ending. It's only the point where the past starts clutching its secrets tighter. And that secret, the child's cry near the bayou, was the first crack revealing that Marcus Hill's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was a story someone had deliberately tried to make vanish. But secrets are never buried forever. Sooner or later, they always surface, like the bayou's surface after a storm. From the early 1980s, the Marcus Hill disappearance entered the coldest, most painful phase of any cold case. The era of vague tips, scattered statements, people claiming "I know the truth," but every one leading to a dead end. Each time a new lead surfaced, the Hill family was pulled up from the edge of despair just a little, only to be dropped harder than before. Donaldsonville had grown used to that pain, but Lorraine and Charles never could. 3 men who claimed "I know where Marcus is buried," and all 3 were wrong. The 1980-1995 period was a strange time in American investigative history. Many drunks, mentally unstable individuals, even fame-seekers would claim involvement in major cases. The Marcus Hill case was no exception. First man, the one who pointed into the cypress woods, in 1981, a hunter called the sheriff's office at 11 p.m., voice shaking, "I know where the kid is buried. I heard people talking. I can show you." The very next morning, the FBI and sheriff led a search team into the cypress woods to the spot he indicated. They dug 3 locations, examined every old tree root, looked for any disturbed soil. Nothing. No bones, no scrap of cloth, no sign a body had ever been there. The man finally admitted he'd only heard rumors from someone at the bar. File note, brief, false lead #27. Second man claimed, "I know the killer." In 1986, another man walked straight into the police station demanding to speak to the FBI. He was so serious the sheriff thought finally something was about to break. Marcus was killed by a man who lived near the bayou. I know where he dumped the body, but when the FBI asked for the killer's name, he gave the name of a man who died in 1962, before Marcus was even born. Medical records confirmed the man suffered mild delusions. He believed voices revealed crimes that hadn't happened yet. Lorraine heard the news and sank to the floor, tears falling silently. Charles was so angry, he had to leave the house for a while. He couldn't take another empty hope. Third man led police to a landfill. In 1992, a homeless man in Baton Rouge called police claiming, "I buried Marcus Hill. I want to confess." Police notified the FBI because it was a federal case. When they followed him, he led them to an old landfill, burned multiple times. After 8 hours of searching, they found only rusted metal and beer cans. Finally he admitted, "I just wanted a free meal and a place to sleep." The sheriff was so furious he had to turn away. The FBI simply noted coldly, "False lead #54, attention seeking." Lorraine heard the story over the phone from Reyes and only said one sentence, "So 3 men said they knew where my son is, and not one told the truth." Tips like these didn't clarify the case, they only made it darker. The man who confessed in a bar, just for attention. In 1988, a brief shock, a 40-year-old man stood up in a Plaquemine bar, banged his beer bottle on the table, and declared, "I kidnapped Marcus Hill in 1967. It was me." The bar went dead silent. Someone called police immediately. When the FBI questioned him, he spun a movie-like story. "I climbed the hill fence. I carried the kid away. I hid him in a cabin near the swamp." But when Hanford asked, "What are the parents' names?" he couldn't answer. What month did Marcus disappear? Didn't know. Which direction is the Hill house? He got it completely wrong. Finally he laughed. "I just wanted people to notice me." A deputy wrote in the file, "He was never in Donaldsonville in 1967. The whole town felt the air leave their lungs. They had hoped, if only for a few hours." Lorraine had to endure one more fall from the peak of hope. The woman in Beaumont, Texas, "I think I saw Marcus." Of all the tips in the 1980-1995 period, this was the one the FBI thought about most, and felt most powerless over. In 1989, a woman around 50 from Beaumont, Texas, called to report she believed she had seen a child who looked exactly like Marcus at a gas station in 1968, just 1 year after he vanished. She described a boy about 7, 8 years old, light brown hair, mole behind the left ear, with a man who wasn't his father. The boy looked scared. At first Reyes thought she was mistaken, but when pressed, the woman accurately described the small scar on the left knee, information never released to the press. Hanford asked, "You remember this after more than 20 years? She nodded. "I never forgot that face. I only just learned the boy was missing." The FBI rushed to Beaumont. They checked the old gas station, now under new ownership. They searched for 1968 camera footage. None existed. They asked employees from back then. All had moved or passed away. They looked for old ownership records. Lost. They asked if she remembered the license plate. She recalled blue plate, but both Texas and Louisiana used blue plates in those years. Nothing could be verified. In the end, Reyes wrote in the report, "Unverified, cannot confirm, cannot dismiss." It was the first time in many years the Hill family felt Marcus might truly still be alive, possibly taken across state lines, possibly being raised under a new identity. But there was no evidence, no perpetrator name, no vehicle description, nothing more than one stranger's memory, and memory, whether true or false, cannot solve a cold case. The years when the case was only an echo, by the late 1980s into the 90s, the Marcus Hill disappearance no longer made the front page of the local paper. It only appeared occasionally, once a year, when the paper ran a piece titled, "Unsolved Louisiana Cases." Lorraine saved every single article in a wooden box. Charles never read them. He couldn't stand seeing his son's case reduced to a few lines of print. The FBI still kept the file open, but every meeting lasted less than half an hour. No new leads, all tracing exhausted. No viable suspects, and the sentence that closed every session, pending, inactive, until further evidence.
Yet somehow Donaldsonville still felt the case wasn't truly asleep.
Every time someone heard a child crying toward the bayou, the old story was retold, about the cry from the first night that vanished from the records. And Lorraine, whenever the swamp wind rattled the windows hard, would wonder, is there someone somewhere who still remembers Marcus the way I do? A cold case isn't an ending, it's only a long silence before the truth surfaces, at a moment no one expects, and that truth was only 58 years away. By 1997, 30 years had passed since the night Marcus disappeared into the darkness of the Hill family kitchen. Donaldsonville had changed a lot. The dirt road behind the Hill house was paved, local stores closed and new businesses opened. Old residents moved away, and newcomers no longer knew the story that once kept the whole parish awake for months. But in the FBI files, the Marcus Hill case still sat quietly under cold case, inactive, like a door that would never open again, until the media touched it, and when the press touches a long-dormant case, it usually wakes up in ways no one can predict. Baton Rouge Advocate runs. The Boy from Bayou Lafourche, June 14, 1997. Exactly the 30-year anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, a young reporter from the Advocate named Claire Fontenot decided to revive the case. She was born near Donaldsonville, and had heard her mother tell the story like a fireside tale, but what she found in the newspaper archives obsessed her: a photo of 7-year-old Marcus, smiling shyly in a light blue shirt, a picture of the Hill house in 1967, dark and tiny, the map of the bayou once swept by airboats, and the FBI note, case inactive pending new evidence. Claire understood that a missing child should not disappear from history just because police ran out of leads. She spent 3 months re-interviewing Lorraine, old neighbors, surviving deputies, and even former suspects like Coulter. One May afternoon she sat in the Hill living room. Lorraine, now 68, hair thin and silver, but her voice still shook when she spoke of Marcus. They tell me I have to learn to let go, but how does a mother let go of a child who was never found? Claire was haunted by that sentence. It became the opening line of a nearly 4,000-word feature with the bold headline, "The Boy from Bayou Lafourche, the Child Who Never Came Home." Sudden attention, the case suddenly came alive again. The story spread with surprising speed. It was shared on Baton Rouge radio, read on morning shows, and reprinted in 3 small Acadiana papers. Hundreds of people called the newsroom. I still remember that night. I think I once saw a toy boat like the one you described. I lived near the hills. I can help. I heard people say Marcus's cry wasn't imaginary. There was a suspicious man who used to live nearby. Claire forwarded every message to the FBI New Orleans. Within days, the Marcus Hill case was back in the media, as if it had never been forgotten. Local radio programs debated the fact that Louisiana had no Amber Alert system in 1967. A pastor at St. Francis held a prayer service for Marcus, whether living or past. For Lorraine, it was the first time in years she felt the community saw her son again. The FBI steps in, but hope crashes back to the old ground. As the article went viral, the FBI New Orleans was forced to re-examine the file. Special Agent Melissa Boudreau, a younger generation cold case specialist, was assigned to compile every tip the media sent in. In 2 weeks she received 38 emails claiming, "I know something," 12 new anonymous letters, 7 calls claiming I saw Marcus, 3 men insisting I know the perpetrator, and 1 woman saying a dream showed me where Marcus is buried. All were investigated, all were wrong. Not one statement could be verified. But what worried Boudreau most was how history repeated itself in an eerie way. The 1997 anonymous letters contained phrases almost identical to the 1967 letter Lorraine received. "He is near. You stopped looking too early. I know where he went." The FBI analyzed the language, but found no clear link between the old and new letters. If the same person wrote them, meaning someone had been watching the case for 30 years, he used 2 completely different handwriting styles. If different people, then multiple individuals still wanted to manipulate the Hill family's emotions. Neither option made sense. The community hoped, but the case stood still. The Boy from Bayou Lafourche, ignited community support in Donaldsonville. For 3 weeks, people put up new Marcus posters, hung his photo in grocery stores, taped it to church windows, shared old memories on local news segments. But after 1 month, with no new leads, attention began to cool, just the way every cold case slips back into darkness. One morning, Lorraine opened the fridge for milk and saw the Advocate clipping held by a magnet. Marcus's smiling photo was still there, but the paper's corner had curled, as if time were reminding her that no matter how many articles, her son still hadn't come home. Charles never believed in the media from the start. He told Claire in a follow-up interview, "You can write beautifully, but words don't bring Marcus back. They don't bring back the child's cry from that night. They don't make whoever tore out that file page come forward and confess." Claire fell silent and understood that stories like hers only bring attention, not answers. Hope fades again. By the end of 1997, the FBI had to close the re-investigation for lack of progress. Boudreau wrote in the report, "Public interest increased dramatically, but produced no verifiable evidence. Case remains cold." Lorraine folded the article back into the wooden box of Marcus's memories. She placed a small crucifix on top and whispered, "Baby." They looked and again, found nothing. And in Donaldsonville, the people who had read the article slowly returned to daily life. Marcus posters peeled off in the wind and rain. Newspapers were tossed into recycling bins. Conversations about the case grew quiet again, and the disappearance of Marcus Hill, after one bright flare from the media, returned to its old place, an unsolved shadow of the past. Only one thing was different from before. For the first time in years, the FBI began to suspect the Marcus case had never been silent. It had been silenced. And all it would take was one more event, one tiny piece, to make the entire 30-year secret crack wide open. But that piece hadn't appeared yet. At least not yet. By the late 1990s, after the media briefly revived the Marcus Hill case only to let it fade again, the FBI New Orleans decided to try a completely new direction, one that hadn't existed in 1967, DNA analysis. The technology was becoming a breakthrough in criminal investigation. Many 1970s, 80s cold cases had been cracked by a single hair, a drop of blood, or a tiny tissue sample still remaining. So, as soon as the media attention pushed the Marcus case back into the light, Special Agent Melissa Boudreau proposed, "Let's test everything that's left." Hope renewed. Could DNA break 30 years of silence? Lorraine Hill, now 68, opened the wooden box she had kept for decades, the box holding the last remnants of her son. Inside were a shirt Marcus wore the day of the church festival, a small pair of white socks, a sheet of paper, where Marcus practiced writing the letter, "M," the tin toy boat. Only possibly his a few hairs kept in a small envelope. The FBI carefully collected every item, sealed, coded, and sent them to the lab at Quantico. Lorraine watched them leave, hands trembling slightly. She had never dared hope too much, but this time, what if science finds something? What if he's still alive? Hope, worn down since 1967, rose again like a piece of driftwood on the water, but that hope quickly slammed into harsh reality. Items from 1967, almost useless. The lab called back in just 3 weeks. The technician's voice on the phone sounded, "Careful, there's a problem. The samples are too old, and were not stored to modern DNA preservation standards. We're trying everything, but the chances are very low." In 1967, no one thought DNA would ever be an investigative tool. Clothing was washed or stored in paper bags, not freeze-dried, not kept away from humidity, not sealed as evidence. And Louisiana is humid, swampy, moldy, the #1 enemy of DNA. When the lab opened the bag with the socks, they had to write in the report, "Degraded beyond recovery, the hairs in the envelope, no root, no marrow, unusable. The tin boat, no useful DNA. Metal had corroded and exposed to damp air for years." The paper Marcus scribbled on, only ink marks, not enough skin cells, but the item the FBI hoped for most, the shirt Marcus wore on the evening of June 24, 1967, produced a twist that left everyone stunned. Marcus's shirt, the chilling result. The lab results reached FBI New Orleans on July 8, 1997. Shirt contains a mixture of DNA from two individuals. Neither belongs to Marcus Hill. Not Marcus. That couldn't be right, according to Lorraine. She swore she hand-washed Marcus's shirt herself and put it away right after the disappearance. No one else had touched it except her. But the lab was 100% certain. Both DNA profiles were unrelated to any known Hill family member. That created three chilling possibilities. Possibility 1. The shirt isn't Marcus's, meaning Marcus wore a different shirt that night, and the family misremembered after so long. Lorraine flatly denied this. Possibility 2. Someone else wore the shirt after Marcus disappeared, meaning someone touched, wore, or used the shirt for something, and then put it back among Marcus's things. Boudreaux asked Lorraine, "Did anyone else ever touch Marcus's shirt after he went missing?" Lorraine nearly broke down crying. "No, I kept everything of his like treasure." If she was right, then who left DNA on the shirt? Possibility 3. Evidence was swapped years ago. The FBI had to consider this. In the 1960s, 70s, evidence at the sheriff's office was often not sealed to modern standards, making mix-ups with other cases possible. But if that happened, where is the real Marcus shirt now? No one knew. A painful truth: the Marcus file cannot be solved by DNA. When the FBI compiled results from every item, the report was filled with the same words: insufficient DNA, no reference sample, DNA degraded, usable, mixed sample, non-match. Especially the final line that truly crushed Lorraine: no DNA belonging to Marcus Hill was found on any remaining evidence. Lorraine read it, covered her face, and sobbed. She whispered, "How, after 30 years, is there nothing left of my son?" Charles just stood silent. He didn't cry, but his face looked erased, empty in a way that was terrifying. The FBI reached a merciless conclusion: for cold cases from the 1960s, DNA was usually the last hope. But the Marcus case became a bitter exception. No remaining physical evidence was of sufficient quality for analysis. No reference sample from Marcus. Nothing that could be verified as belonging to the boy. Reyes wrote in the 1997 file closing report, "DNA technology cannot advance this case. Physical evidence limitations prevent any forward movement." In other words, even modern technology could not solve the Marcus Hill case. The file remained colder than ever. But what no one expected was that, right when the FBI declared DNA useless, a new lead, unrelated to physical evidence, began to emerge from a place no one had imagined. A place almost 200 miles from Donaldsonville. A place where a man knew something no one in the files had ever mentioned. And he, after 30 years of silence, was finally ready to speak. In 2014, summer in Donaldsonville was hotter than any in memory. Bayou Lafourche steamed with such heavy humidity that every step off the porch felt like walking into a sealed room. The old folks at St. Francis Parish whispered that the hotter the summer, the easier old memories surface. But that year the memory no longer rose from the bayou. It rose from a small hospital room, where Lorraine Hill drew her final breath, after nearly half a century, living with the shadow of one unanswered question: where is Marcus? She left in silence, the same silence as the case itself. Lorraine was admitted at the end of June, with heart complications. Emily, now almost 50 and living in Baton Rouge, stayed by her mother's bedside every night. Charles had died in 2002, so Emily was both daughter and the last remaining family. What caught the nurses' attention was that every year as June 24th approached, Lorraine grew agitated. They said she dreamed constantly, mumbling in her sleep, always calling the same name everyone knew: Marcus, Marcus, don't go. On the morning of June 24th, 2014, exactly 47 years to the day, Marcus vanished. Lorraine Hill took her last breath. No child's cry, no bayou wind, only the flatline tone of the heart monitor. Emily held her mother, tears falling into her hair. Many said Lorraine died carrying the ultimate pain of a mother who never found her child. But the truth was, she carried something else too, something no one knew. she had kept locked inside. The wooden box, the mother's final relic. 2 weeks after the funeral, Emily received a call from the family lawyer. He asked her to come to the office to receive one last thing Lorraine left. Emily was surprised. She thought she had already received everything. But the lawyer handed her a small old wooden box, edges chipped, with a tiny padlock. Emily recognized it immediately. It was the box her mother had kept Marcus's mementos in for 47 years, the paper where he practiced writing Emin, the little white socks, the tin boat, the church festival photo, the memory box. But this time, when she opened it, Emily found something that had never been there before, a handwritten letter from Lorraine herself. The paper yellowed, the ink slightly blurred in one corner as if tears had smudged it. The first line stopped Emily cold. "Emily, my love, if you are reading this letter, it means I am gone." She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to stay calm. The letter continued. "There is one thing I never dared speak while I was alive. It has haunted me every June 24th. Emily swallowed hard. Her eyes raced over the shaky, slanted handwriting. "Your brother did not leave alone. I heard someone call his name." Emily froze, heart pounding. Someone's voice? A man? Someone familiar? The abductor? Someone from the community? But the letter went on. "That night, when I called for Marcus in the kitchen, I heard a whisper right at the back door. Someone said, 'Marcus, come here.' I thought I imagined it, because the bayou wind was blowing hard. But the older I got, the more certain I became that it was not the wind." Emily had to sit down. This sentence haunted her more than anything. "Such I silent, because I was afraid no one would believe me. But I know my son walked toward that voice, not because he was forced, but because he thought it was someone he knew." Emily set the letter down, hands shaking uncontrollably. She whispered, "Mom, why didn't you tell the FBI? Why did you keep this for 47 years? But the rest of the letter answered everything. The sheriff said no one was in the yard. The FBI said there were no footprints. No one believes a desperate mother. I was afraid they would think I was crazy. I was afraid they would blame me. So I stayed silent. Forever." A secret never revealed. Emily read the letter 5 more times. She remembered the 1967 story, the missing notebook page about a child crying near the bayou. Now her mother's words opened a new reality. It wasn't just a child's cry. There was also a call, an adult's voice, someone who knew Marcus's name. And Marcus was not afraid of that person. She asked herself, was the abductor someone known to him? A neighbor? Someone who regularly appeared at church festivals? Someone who knew Marcus's routine? Or the same person who paid to have the notebook page removed in 1967? A chill crept from Emily's neck down her spine. Until now, the FBI had always viewed the Marcus case as a non-family abduction, taken by a stranger. But if Marcus toured the voice, the perpetrator was no stranger. He was someone Marcus trusted, someone Marcus recognized in the dark, someone who knew the boy would come out the back door at that exact moment. That voice could explain everything. No signs of struggle, no screams, no running footprints, door not forced, and especially Marcus walked out, completely willingly. It made Emily choke with both pain and sudden clarity. The letter changed the entire perception. At the end of the letter Lorraine wrote, "Emily, if you want to find your brother again, start with the people we once thought were harmless. Marcus knew that voice, and that person knew your mother's child." Emily sat motionless for a long time. That tiny letter, hidden for decades, was more powerful than any evidence the FBI had ever collected. Not DNA, not physical proof, not a witness, but a mother's instinct, hearing what no one else heard, then silent for half a century out of fear of being dismissed, or fear that the truth was worse than silence. Emily decided to reopen the case, in her own way. She clutched the letter, looking out the lawyer's office window. Wind from Bayou Lafourche blew in, hot and sticky like 1967. She understood one thing. This was not a will. It was the last message from a mother to the last person left in the family. You have to be the one to find the truth. Emily left the office hugging the wooden box to her chest. Lorraine had taken that secret to her grave. But Emily, the last person carrying the Hill name, would not let that secret be buried, not ever again. And from that letter, from one sentence never spoken aloud, I heard someone call his name. The Marcus Hill case, for the first time in 47 years, had a new investigative direction, one leading to a horrifying truth no one in Donaldsonville had ever dared imagine. In 2022, the Marcus Hill case was almost buried under 55 years of dust. After Lorraine's death, Emily kept chasing every tiny clue, rereading every file page, every faded note, and every line her mother wrote in that deathbed letter. Marcus knew that voice, but nothing moved her forward, until one September afternoon, when an email from 23andMe appeared on Emily's phone and blew everything wide open. A 65-year-old man in Texas, unaware he was about to rewrite the history of a case. Mark Hastings, 65, living in Beaumont, Texas, was so ordinary that no one would notice if he walked past. Retired after 40 years in air conditioning repair, Mark spent his golden years growing tomatoes in the backyard, playing dominoes at the coffee shop, and occasionally attending Woodland Heights Baptist Church. He had never been involved in investigations, never spent more than a fishing weekend in Louisiana. He had no idea his life was tied to a boy missing since 1967. In August 2022, his cardiologist recommended genetic testing for hereditary risks. His son bought him a 23andMe kit, just for health reasons. No one in the family imagined that kit would expose a truth hidden for half a century. The result appeared, and there was a name: Emily Hill. When Mark opened the app to view his results, he saw a notification: "You have a new close DNA relative. Emily Hill, predicted relationship, half-sibling." Mark blinked. He had no half-siblings. Family history was crystal clear, only child. But DNA doesn't lie. Mark thought it was a mistake, but the app showed page after page of genetic markers, proving the woman named Emily Hill shared over 23% of his DNA. Impossible. Impossible. He closed the app, opened it again, closed it again. He spent the entire afternoon staring at the screen. Emily received the notification, heart pounding like it was 1967 all over again. In Baton Rouge, Emily was making dinner for her son, when her phone buzzed: "You have a new DNA match." It had happened before, always distant cousins. Emily opened the app, and her heart stopped. Mark Hastings, 65 years old, predicted relationship, half-sibling, half-brother. Impossible. Marcus, if alive, would be 62 now, not 65. But age predictions can be off by a few years. The system had been wrong by 3 years in many cases. She stared at the screen. She whispered, "Marcus, is that you?" Emily reached out, and the answer left her speechless. Emily sent a message through the app. "Hello Mark, I don't know how to start. 23, and me says we are half-siblings. Same mother. My mother's name was Lorraine Hill. Do you know anything about your biological family?" She waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. Then Mark replied, "I didn't know I was adopted. I don't know who Lorraine Hill is. I don't know anything." Emily felt her heart drop to her stomach. She asked immediately, "What year were you adopted?" Mark answered, 1967. "I was found in Houston when I was very small, but there was no valid birth certificate." Emily stood up straight. Houston, only a 4-hour drive from Donaldsonville. 1967, the year Marcus disappeared. A 7-year-old taken away would certainly have no valid papers. The air in the room turned thick. Emily braced herself on the table, heart hammering. The first call, fragmented memories. Mark agreed to a video call. When the screen lit up, Emily almost couldn't breathe. The man in front of her had the same brown eyes as Lorraine, and the way he tilted his head when listening, exactly like Marcus in the only photo left. Emily, tears rolling down, asked, "Do you remember anything from when you were little? Anything at all?" Mark frowned. He had never thought he had memories before age 5. But when Emily asked, his face suddenly changed, like something opened under layers of dust. He spoke slowly. "I remember flashes of light on dark water, someone carrying me, running through dark water. I remember the smell of mud, and a woman crying." Emily gripped the phone tighter. Marcus disappeared next to Bayou Lafourche, where the mud smell was so distinctive, Lorraine said, you could recognize it blindfolded. And her mother's words in the letter, your brother did not leave alone. Emily asked, do you remember the woman's face? Mark shook his head. No, I only remember her saying, we're going now, and she was shaking. Emily almost dropped the phone. A woman's voice, not a man's. This shattered every previous FBI theory. And then, the sentence that sent ice down Emily's spine. Mark continued, there's one more thing I remember. A man standing in the dark, saying nothing, just nodding. I think he handed me to that woman. Emily covered her mouth. Lorraine's letter had said, I heard someone call his name. It didn't have to be a man. It could have been the woman carrying Marcus. The man behind her said nothing, just directed. Emily asked, voice shaking, do you remember anything they said to each other? Mark furrowed his brow, concentrating, just one very quiet thing, like an echo. The man said, hurry, they'll see. The room seemed to freeze around Emily. Marcus wasn't lured, he wasn't grabbed in the open. He was handed off, in a planned operation. Verification, DNA that cannot be denied. The FBI New Orleans office was notified the moment Emily reported the DNA match. They asked Mark to come to the Beaumont Police Department for an official sample. 3 weeks later the results arrived from Quantico, a match. 99.99998% probability that Mark Hastings is the full brother of Emily Hill. No one in the conference room said a word. Emily burst into tears the moment she heard the first sentence. Mark Hastings is Marcus Hill. The FBI entered into the report. Case status reopened. Missing person confirmed alive. Suspected abduction and illegal adoption. 1967. But the joy did not last long. Because the moment the case was reopened, Mark's fragmented memories began to snap together into a chilling picture. Marcus was not rescued. He was not adopted by chance. He was taken by a group of people, organized, planned, and with a specific target. Mark still could not remember the face of the man in the shadows, but he said one sentence that made the FBI agents look at each other in shock. The woman said to me, be quiet, or they'll find us. I didn't understand it when I was little, but now I think, they didn't want anyone to know I was still alive. Emily clenched her fists. Her mother had been right. Marcus did not leave alone, and someone had called the boy out the back door that night. But who? And why had Marcus been the target? The next part of the story would reveal what the FBI had never dared imagine in the 1967 files. Marcus was not murdered. He was not abducted at random. He was placed into an illegal interstate adoption ring, one that swallowed hundreds of Southern children in the 1960s. And the man standing in the darkness that night, the one who called Marcus by name, was not the stranger they had always believed. In 2023, just 3 months after the Quantico DNA results confirmed Mark Hastings was Marcus Hill, the FBI New Orleans field office officially declared the 1967 Ascension Parish case reopened, fully reopened. For the first time in 56 years, the name Marcus Hill was listed again as a living person, no longer missing, presumed deceased. But to turn a DNA match into legal confirmation, the FBI needed more than one piece of evidence, and everything that happened in the next 60 days solidified the entire picture beyond any doubt. Mark was the 7-year-old boy who vanished from Donaldsonville in 1967. Age progression, 90% match, an extremely rare level. Immediately after reopening, the FBI sent every photo of Marcus 1965-1967 to the forensic artists at Quantico. They produced an age progression image, simulating Marcus's face at age 60. When the finished sketch was placed beside current photos of Mark Hastings, the result took everyone's breath away. 90% morphological match. The forensic artists noted, Nopal almost identical cheekbone structure, Nopal intercanthal distance space between the eyes, identical mouth line and curve of the lower lip, similar forehead dome and hairline pattern, especially the habit of tilting the head to the right when listening, a very rare behavioral trait that matched Lorraine's 1965 description. Special Agent Boudreau placed the two images side by side and said, "Even if we didn't have DNA, I would believe he's Marcus just from these pictures." Age progression is only this accurate in a handful of famous cases. 90% is virtually impossible unless the individuals share the same biological origin, one scar, and a mother's memory. In the 1967 file, Lorraine had noted a detail the FBI once considered unimportant. Marcus has a 2-inch scar on his back, slightly to the right, from falling off the back stairs in 1965. They kept it as reference, but never thought it would become evidence 50 years later. When Emily met Mark in person, for the first time in Beaumont and hugged him, she said, "Do you have any scars?" Mark was surprised, but lifted his shirt. Emily nearly collapsed. A 2-inch scar, shifted to the right, perfectly matching the 1967 description, chillingly exact. Mark vaguely remembered falling off a big wooden box as a small child, but his adoptive family knew nothing about it. They only said he'd had the scar since he was little. The FBI immediately recorded, "Unique childhood scar, positive match." This is considered a gold standard identifier when no childhood photos exist. Newborn fingerprints, evidence no one thought still existed. In the dusty archives of the Ascension Parish Sheriff's Office, a detail forgotten for half a century suddenly became the most crucial piece. When Agent Boudreau asked for every original item, an elderly clerk said, "I'm not sure, but maybe this is still here." She brought out a small evidence bag, sealed since 1965, 2 years before the disappearance. Inside, the plastic cup Marcus always used, a few sheets of his scribbles. Marcus's fingerprint card taken when he started kindergarten, a Louisiana child safety program at the time. No one expected the card still existed. No one had ever entered it into the file because no one imagined a day would come when they'd need to compare a child's prints to an adult who didn't know he'd been missing. The FBI compared the card to fingerprints taken from Mark at Beaumont PD. Results took exactly 10 days. When the file came back from Quantico, it contained only 2 large words, "Match confirmed." Match level 97.3%, far too high to be coincidence. Because fingerprints never change. Special Agent Reyes wrote in the report, "With DNA age progression, childhood scar and fingerprint match, the question is no longer is Mark Marcus, but where has Marcus been for 58 years, and who took him?" The memory fragments fall into place, and the chill spreads. When the FBI asked Mark about the scattered memories that had surfaced, especially after Emily's contact, the agents realized they aligned perfectly with both the 1967 file and the letter their mother left Emily. Memory 1. Flashes of light on dark water. Mark vaguely remembered streaks of light on black water. Donaldsonville, 1967, Bayou Lafourche ran directly behind the Hill House, and police had noted water reflecting car lights the night of the disappearance. Memory 2. A woman carrying him, shaking and crying. In the letter Lorraine wrote, "I heard someone call his name." She never specified it was a man's voice. Now Mark clearly remembered the person carrying him was a woman. This forced the FBI to reverse its entire perpetrator profile. Memory 3. A man standing in the darkness, nodding. In the 1967 file, one witness had said, he saw the shadow of a man at the hill fence, but the witness changed his story 3 times, so it was dismissed. Now that statement became extremely valuable. Memory 4. The quiet sentence Mark still remembered, like an echo, "Hurry, they'll see." In the disappearance night file, Deputy Renaud noted, "Hill back door open, strong wind, no answer when calling Marcus's name." Marcus was removed quickly, just fast enough to avoid being seen. Official FBI confirmation, Marcus Hill is alive, and his new identity is Mark Hastings. November 2023, the FBI New Orleans office completed the re-identification paperwork. DNA match 99.99998%, fingerprint, match 97.3% niece, scar identification, conclusive age progression, 90% morphological similarity, memory alignment, consistent with 1967 evidence, circumstantial adoption timeline, perfect alignment. In an internal briefing, a veteran agent said, "We have just witnessed the seemingly impossible, a child missing for 58 years, found alive." But that joy instantly gave way to a bigger question. How did Mark become Mark Hastings? Who moved the boy from Louisiana to Texas? Who was the woman who carried him? Why was Marcus taken, and not killed? The FBI believes the answer lies in something Mark has carried his whole life, unconsciously. And in the subsequent memory recovery therapy sessions, Mark began to recall one horrifying detail: a name. A name that when Emily heard it, made her shoot up from her chair, as if electrocuted. A name that was in the 1967 suspect file, but had once been cleared for insufficient evidence. Now every eye turned back to the past. Who called Marcus out the door that night? And why that person? When the FBI established that Mark Hastings was indeed Marcus Hill, the next question crashed down on the entire investigative team like thunder. Who took Marcus from Louisiana to Texas in 1967? Among the records related to Mark's childhood, the most prominent name was Eldon Ray Price, the man who raised Mark from around age 7-8, living in the Beaumont, Texas suburbs throughout the 1970s. Eldon Price died in 2004, but his story had never truly been told. And when the FBI began digging into the past, long-buried shadows started coming back to life. The quiet man with the heavy-duty truck. According to tax records and employment files, Eldon Price was a long-haul truck driver running the Louisiana-Texas route throughout the 1960s. Specifically, the record showed 1966-1968, Price regularly drove Donaldsonville, Baton Rouge, Lake Charles, Beaumont. He often stopped at riverside rest areas, especially those with small docks. He was in Baton Rouge on June 25, 1967, one day after Marcus disappeared. That alone was enough for the FBI to launch a full investigation. When agents asked Emily if the name Price had ever come up in family life when she was young, she shook her head. No one in the Hill family had ever known anyone by that name. Yet when Mark heard it, he suddenly frowned. "I don't remember clearly, but I think he always called me boy, never my real name. And I've never forgotten the smell of engine oil on his clothes." A truck driver, exactly as the record stated. What did the neighbors say? A story that made the FBI's hair stand on end. The New Orleans and Beaumont PD investigative team went to the neighborhood where Price lived for 30 years. They interviewed 8 former neighbors, and the same story emerged from 3 separate households. A woman named Mary Collins, now 82, told the agents, "I remember that year clearly. Mr. Price brought home a child. The boy was soaked to the bone, shaking like a leaf. I asked him, what happened to him? He just said, fell in the ditch. I pulled him out. But the child's eyes were red like he'd been crying for hours." The FBI stopped writing, "fell in the ditch." Soaked Bayou Lafourche was exactly that, a dark waterway many once feared Marcus had fallen into. Yet Marcus lived to remember being carried through dark water. Mrs. Collins's account sent chills down the agent's spines. Another neighbor, Leonard Tate, 76, said Price wasn't a bad man, but he was hiding something. "I remember he always locked the house tight whenever he went to work, like he was afraid someone would come take the boy." The FBI asked directly, did anyone believe he was the boy's biological father? Tate answered softly, no one. The kid didn't look a thing like him. The adoption file, the biggest plot twist since the case reopened. The FBI located Price's adoption records at Jefferson County Court, Texas. Every document stated, child surrendered by an unnamed intermediary, identity of biological parents unknown. There was no birth certificate, original medical records, mother's name of the person who delivered the child, only a handwritten note from the judge at the time. The adopting party states child was obtained through a private custody arrangement, a polite way of describing an illegal adoption. The FBI knew they had just touched something far more dangerous, an underground network trading undocumented children across the South in the 1960s. Not loud criminal syndicates, but small tight-knit rings passing children to people who wanted a child, and were willing to pay. and Eldon Price was part of that network. Not the mastermind. Not the abductor, but the receiver. Did Price abduct Marcus himself? Agents faced a hard-to-believe truth. The deeper the FBI dug into Price's life, the more contradictions emerged. 1. Price was in Louisiana at the exact time. Driving logs placed him in Baton Rouge June 25, 26, 1967. 2. Price had been near Donaldsonville more than once. 2 gas receipts from White Castle and Plaquemine, only 20-30 minutes from the Hill House. 3. He brought home a soaking wet child, matching both Mark's memory and neighbor statements. 4. But twist, Price had no criminal record or history of violence. Described as quiet, friendless, but never aggressive. 5. And most importantly, the paperwork showed he did not abduct the child himself. He received the boy from an intermediary. This pushed the FBI in a completely new direction. If Price didn't abduct Marcus, who handed Marcus to him? In the 1967 file, 5 people had once been suspected, but only one of them had pulse, access to children, the ability to move a child across state lines, a reason to hand off a child to someone else, and that person had been cleared by local police. Insufficient evidence. The biggest mistake of the 1967 investigation was starting to surface. A secret Price took to his grave. Eldon Price died in 2004 of kidney failure, leaving little behind. But among the old papers the FBI seized from Texas storage, one detail made them freeze: an unsealed envelope containing a handwritten note. "The boy belongs to them. I just gave him a home. I didn't know the truth until later." The last line was scrawled, ink blurred as if written while shaking. "She told me he came from the water." She. A woman. Exactly like Mark's memory, the woman who carried him through dark water. Exactly like what Lorraine heard the night of the disappearance, a voice calling Marcus out the door. The FBI began reconstructing the entire chain of events. 1. Marcus was lured out the back door by someone familiar, a woman's voice. 2. A man stood outside the fence supervising. 3. Marcus was carried across water, possibly the bayou, to avoid detection. 4. Marcus was handed off to Eldon Price at a drop point along the Louisiana-Texas trucking route. 5. Price took the child without knowing whose hands were really behind it. When he learned the truth, it was too late. He never dared go to the police. He raised Marcus as his own but carried that fear for the rest of his life. An obsession Mark could never explain until now. After hearing what the FBI uncovered, Mark sat silent for a long time. He looked down at his hands and said, "When I was little, I used to dream of a man standing by the water. I thought it was made up, but now I know it was real." Then he added a sentence that silenced every agent in the room. "In the dream, the man wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the woman holding me, and he said, 'Tonight is the night.'" Emily gripped her brother's hand and whispered, "So Mom was right for 58 years. Price was not the most important link. Someone lured Marcus out of the house. Someone carried the boy through dark water. Someone delivered Marcus to Price. Price was only the unwitting gatekeeper, not the monster. So who was the woman? Who was the man standing in the shadows? And what did "tonight is the night" mean? The FBI New Orleans office closed the Price segment of the investigation with one line in the report: Eldon Price was not the perpetrator. He was merely the keeper of the perpetrator's secret, a secret he took to his grave. But another figure began rising from the fog of the past, one that DNA, memory, and neighbor testimony all pointed to. Someone who was within 100 meters of the Hill House that night. Someone Lorraine had once suspected, but never dared say. Someone who had been cleared far too early. And now, after 58 years, that name was coming back like a ghost from the bayou. The day Emily met Mark Hastings again, the brother she had mourned for nearly 6 decades, the Beaumont weather was lightly humid, gray clouds hanging as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The FBI chose a small conference room at Beaumont PD headquarters, windows looking out on ancient oaks. Emily walked in clutching the scarf her mother had worn while searching for Marcus in 1967. Her hands shook, not from fear, but because the truth finally had shape, voice, and breath. Mark stood when she entered. They stared at each other without blinking, as if time had choked in mid-air. And then Emily cried first. Mark said nothing. He simply opened his arms. That embrace lasted longer than any words could ever describe. Emily pressed her head against Mark's shoulder, voice breaking. "You were alive. All those years alone." Mark closed his eyes. Not always alone, but never in the right place. They sat facing each other, and the FBI began recording the most important statements since the case reopened. Memories opening, no longer aimless fragments. Mark spoke slowly, like someone digging through very thin soil with something dangerous and deep beneath. "Ever since I learned I'm Marcus, the same images keep coming back. A wooden house, not Price's house, smaller, older, and the smell of swamp mud. Exactly like the damp that clung to my clothes whenever I woke up at night." Emily never took her eyes off him. She whispered, "That could be where they kept you the first few days." Mark nodded slightly. "I also remember a shadow standing in the doorway. A man." He said to the woman, "Don't let him go back there." The room went silent. The FBI knew what that sentence meant. Go back there, meaning the Hill House. The place Marcus had to avoid at all costs. The place where, if Marcus ever appeared, everything would collapse. Mark touched his temple, trying to remember more clearly. I don't remember his face, but his voice, low, not loud. The kind of voice a child wouldn't be afraid of. That was what sent chills down the FBI's spine. A 7-year-old boy was not afraid of that man, meaning Marcus knew him from before. The wooden house near the swamp, an unexpected key. When the FBI showed Mark satellite imagery of the 1967 Donaldsonville area, reconstructed from old maps, Mark pointed immediately to the region south of Bayou Lafourche. "Right here. I don't remember the house, but I remember light shining through a clearing between 2 rows of trees." Special Agent Boudreau zoomed in on the map. In the 1967 files, that area once held fishing cabins, later abandoned when the levee was expanded. The entire team looked at one another. A wooden cabin near the bayou. Exactly Mark's description. It also matched the statement from a young witness in the old file who once reported hearing a child crying from the swamp direction. And that note had been made to disappear from the original records. No longer coincidence, it was a timeline finally revealing its thread. Emily heard the most painful part. Marcus remembered the night he vanished. When the FBI shifted questions to the night of June 24, June 1967, Mark froze. He frowned, as if a thick fog were lifting. "I remember the kitchen light. I remember the smell of Mom's fried chicken still lingering. I remember walking out the back door, because someone called my name." Emily's breathing grew rapid. It was a woman's voice. I knew that voice. Mark paused a long time, then said, she said, "Come here, Marcus, it's okay." That is how someone familiar coaxes a child. Not how a stranger abductor calls, Mark continued, voice trembling slightly. "I stepped outside, the woman picked me up. Then she ran. We went into the water. She slipped. The water was very cold." Emily covered her mouth. It all matched what Price's neighbors had said. Marcus arrived in Texas soaked, shaking uncontrollably. The man in the shadows, the central figure of the nightmare. The FBI asked, "Do you remember the man behind her?" Mark closed his eyes and took a deep breath. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Then he opened his eyes and looked straight at Emily. "I never saw his face. I only saw him standing by the fence, saying nothing." Then he nodded. Emily burst into tears. She knew that detail, because one 1967 witness had reported seeing a man standing exactly there. But police dismissed it because the witness changed his story. Mark had no access to that file. He could not have made it up. The man's sentence still echoed in Mark's head. "Tonight is the night." The entire room fell silent. Tonight is the night for what? To move the child, to hand the child off, to sever ties with the Hill family forever. Boudreau looked at Emily and said quietly, "Someone planned this in advance. David Masterson, in Montana, abducted to kill. This was more organized." Emily held her brother's hand. both facing the same pain but in completely different ways. Emily turned to Mark, eyes wet. You lived your whole life not knowing you had been taken from your family. Mark placed his hand over hers. I don't remember Mom, I don't remember Dad, but every time I smelled river mud, I felt a familiarity that scared me. Emily cried harder. That was the smell of Bayou Lafourche, the place Marcus was born, raised and vanished from, the root of 58 years of pain. Mark asked, did Mom Lorraine ever stop looking for me? Emily shook her head. Not a single day. Mark lowered his head, shoulders shaking. In 58 years, this was the first time he cried, not from memory, but from the truth about the mother he never got to see again. And then, the most crucial memory fragment finally surfaced. Just as the FBI was about to wrap up the session, Mark suddenly looked up, face tense. I just remembered one more thing from the woman. The room turned back to him. Mark swallowed hard, and said, she said, don't let his family know. Emily went pale. That was not something a panicked abductor would say. That was the sentence of someone participating in a plan. And Agent Boudreau whispered, that woman was no stranger. She knew Marcus, and she knew the Hill family. The room sank into silence. Emily's tears fell, not only because she had found her brother, but because the truth emerging was this. Marcus was not abducted at random. He was not attacked. He was not lured by a stranger. The boy was taken by someone the Hill family had once trusted, and the memory Mark had just unlocked would lead the FBI to the central figure, the woman whose voice Lorraine heard the night her son disappeared. As the FBI traced Eldon Price's adoption paperwork and found unusual gaps, they knew they had to find the person behind the files stamped private custody, no biological record. Every clue led to a faded name in old Beaumont archives, Marjorie Ann Cole, administrative clerk and family records advisor at Jefferson County, from 1963 to 1978. Mrs. Cole was now 85, living in a quiet nursing home by the Neckus River. Her memory was no longer sharp, but when the FBI visited and mentioned the name Eldon Price, her eyes instantly widened, full of wariness, full of old memories yanked back to the surface. I never kidnapped anyone. I only did paperwork. Special Agent Boudreau began the interview gently. Mrs. Cole stared at her trembling hands, smoothing the edge of her knitted shawl. I only did what a lot of people did back then. There were families who wanted children, but couldn't adopt legally. The FBI asked directly, did you handle paperwork for Eldon Price? Marjorie nodded at once. Yes, I remember it well. Mr. Price brought in a child with no papers, no birth certificate, nothing. I had to create an entirely new file. That was the answer they had waited weeks for. Boudreau placed a copy of the 1968 Mark Hastings birth certificate in front of her. Mrs. Cole looked at it and gave a sad little smile. Yes, that's my signature. But the story did not end there. Marjorie denied Price was the abductor. The FBI asked, did Mr. Price ever explain where the child came from? Marjorie clutched her shawl. No, and I didn't ask, but I do know one thing. The child was not abducted by Price. He wasn't the type. This aligned perfectly with everything the FBI had already uncovered. Price received the child from someone else. Marcus looked at Mrs. Cole and asked softly, do you remember me? When I was little. Marjorie studied his face deeply. I remember the eyes. The child had terrified eyes, like he had been through something too big for his age. She swallowed, then said the sentence that silenced the room. Eldon didn't bring the child in alone. Someone came with him. A man wearing a soaked shirt shaking violently. The FBI immediately took notice. This was a detail that had never appeared in any previous record. When they walked into the office, the man with Price was drenched, like he'd just stepped out of water. Shirt clinging to him, shoes caked in black mud. Mrs. Cole paused, breathing slowly, and he was shaking, really shaking. Not the cold kind of shaking, the kind when someone has just done something there's no going back from. Mark felt ice run down his spine. Emily leaned back in her chair, trying to stay calm. Boudreau asked, did he say anything? Marjorie closed her eyes as if searching. I remember he said one thing, hurry up. Don't use his real name. Mark whipped his head toward Emily. That was the exact voice he heard in his buried memory. Don't let him go back there. The pieces fit together in a chilling way. Price didn't know, but the man in the wet shirt knew exactly what he was doing. Marjorie continued. Price stood a step behind him. I never knew what the two men were to each other, but it was clear who was in control. The man in the wet shirt. The FBI showed her photos of 3 people linked to Donaldsonville in 1967. Mass Pastor Lemay cleared, Raymond Coulter exonerated, Harold Duplantier, the Hill neighbor who changed his story 3 times about seeing someone's shadow in the backyard. Marjorie studied each photo carefully, but shook her head. No, none of these. The man I saw didn't look like a Louisiana local at all. Agent Boudreau tilted her head. What do you mean? Mrs. Cole said slowly. He didn't have a Cajun accent. No southern drawl. His voice sounded more northern. I dealt with a lot of people passing through on the highway. I'd guess he came from very far away. This turned the entire case into a completely different puzzle. The perpetrator was not local. Not a friend of the Hill family. Not someone Lorraine would recognize by voice. So who was the woman who called Marcus out the door? And where did the man in the wet shirt come from? Why Marjorie still remembered that man after 50 years, Marjorie continued, voice dropping lower. I remember him, because his hands were covered in cuts, long scratches, still fresh, like he'd been torn by thorns, or something sharp. Mark's eyes widened. I remember dark water, and light glinting off something metal. The entire room understood instantly. The swamp behind the Hill house was full of hundreds of barbed wire strands, stakes, old fishing nets, enough to slice anyone running through the night. Boudreau asked the most critical question. Did you see him touch the child? Marjorie nodded slowly. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Not a caress. More like claiming, he's mine. I've never forgotten the look in his eyes. Mark felt a stab in his head. A flash memory. A heavy hand on his shoulder, squeezing hard, then pushing him toward Price. A belated confession. Unable to reverse the truth. Special Agent Boudreau asked, why did you agree to create a fake birth certificate? Mrs. Cole's eyes welled up. I was young. I didn't fully understand. I saw a shaking man, a freezing child, and Price said, he needs a family. What happened can't be undone. By the time I knew the truth, it was too late to fix it. Emily whispered, do you think the child Marcus was sold? Marjorie looked down at her hands and said nothing. Her silence was the answer. One final piece of data that sent the case in a major new direction. After regaining composure, Marjorie said, after that day, the man in the wet shirt never came back. No one knew his real name. Then she said the sentence that made the FBI jump, but I remember his truck plate started with OO. I think it was from Ohio. Ohio, a state very far from Louisiana, a place where illegal child trafficking rings were highly active in the 1960s. Boudreau looked at Emily, then at Mark. The person who took Marcus was not local. It's starting. This ring is bigger than we thought. A chill ran down everyone's spine. The question was no longer, who abducted Marcus? It had become, which organization did Marcus end up in? Why was he in Louisiana at exactly that moment? And who in the hill town helped him get access to Marcus? In the 1967 file, there was one name once considered innocent, for lack of evidence. But now, the time to look again had come. After Marjorie Cole's statement, the FBI re-examined the full list of everyone who could have reached Marcus on the night of June 24, 1967. One name that had previously been treated as background suddenly stood out above all others: Pastor David Lemay, the young pastor of St. Francis Church in Donaldsonville. In the 1967 file, Pastor Lemay had been interviewed, but had an alibi. Stayed late at the church preparing the next day's sermon. Local police, who respected clergy as moral symbols, quickly cleared him. But in 2023, when the FBI reopened the case, details once brushed aside took on new shape. The child sent by God, a sermon no one paid attention to back then. When the FBI recovered old church cassette recordings from the 1960s, kept by a parishioner as a keepsake, they found a sermon by Pastor Lemay recorded July 2, 1967, exactly 1 week after Marcus vanished. On the tape, LeMay's voice was deep and fervent. There are children in this world who do not belong where they were born. God sends them to other families who truly need them. The statement froze the investigative team. Back then, parishioners heard phrases like that all the time. They were used to the pastor's metaphors, but when the FBI connected those words to the reality of Marcus being handed from a woman's arms to Price, LeMay's language took on an entirely different tone. Agent Boudreaux said, "If this is just metaphor, it's an impossibly strange coincidence with the Marcus Hill case." Lorraine had suspected, but never told police. While reviewing Lorraine Hill's notes, Emily found a small forgotten notebook inside the memory box. Among pages filled with longing for her son, one line written July 12, 1967, ink still dark. "I don't want to suspect Pastor David, but something in his voice makes me shudder. He looked at me after the prayer service and said sometimes God leads children elsewhere to do great things. I wanted to believe it was comfort, but why do I feel afraid?" Lorraine had never shown this note to police. She feared people would judge her or think grief had driven her mad. Emily cried as she read it. Mom saw something. Mom felt it. Now the FBI treated it as critical psychological evidence, because a victim's parents' intuition often reveals corners the law overlooks. Testimony from an elderly parishioner: the pastor once carried Marcus down to the Bayou Bank. When the FBI interviewed people who lived near the church in 1967, they spoke to Mrs. Agnes Broussard, now 89. When she heard LeMay's name, she trembled. "I remember once seeing Pastor David walking Marcus toward the water behind the church after Sunday service. He told me, 'I'm taking the boy to pray for a bit.' I thought nothing of it. Who would suspect a pastor?" The FBI asked, "Did you ever see him carry Marcus?" Mrs. Agnes nodded. "Yes," and Marcus smiled at him. The boy trusted him completely. The room fell silent. The man Marcus trusted, the one who could call him out the back door, had appeared. Major evidence: LeMay's financial records match mysterious transactions. In the diocesan archives, the FBI located Pastor LeMay's personal expense ledger. On June 28, 1967, 4 days after the disappearance, a $900 entry appeared. "Donation for mission work, anonymous source," but the FBI traced the money to an account based in Toledo, Ohio. Exactly the detail Marjorie Cole had provided, the wet-shirted man's truck plate from Ohio. Boudreaux laid the documents on the table. No longer coincidence, the connection is clear. The truth in the shadows: LeMay had ties to an extremist religious group. The FBI kept digging and uncovered something shocking. LeMay had trained at an independent religious center in Cleveland, Ohio. That group had once been suspected of involvement in placement ministry, a belief that God has the right to place children with new families to fulfill their destiny. An extremist religious sect that believed children could be moved from poor families to God-chosen ones. This file had been ignored in 1967, because the concept of cult trafficking didn't exist back then. Boudreaux wrote, "Likelihood that Pastor LeMay participated in an illegal child placement ring is extremely high." Confronting Emily, Pastor LeMay breaks. Emily met Pastor LeMay during a special interview. He was now 83, hands shaking but eyes still sharp. Emily looked at him, voice choking. "You know what happened to my brother, you know." LeMay bowed his head and breathed heavily. He whispered, "I didn't take him myself, but I knew." Boudreaux asked, "Who handed Marcus to Eldon Price?" LeMay shook, "A man from up north. They said the child would be placed where he belonged. I swear, I thought it was religious work. I didn't know it was a crime." Emily slammed the table. "Do you know how much my mother suffered? You stood in the pulpit, you looked her in the eye, and you said God took children elsewhere?" LeMay broke down crying. For the first time since the case reopened, a suspect completely collapsed. Pastor LeMay arrested, charged with concealing the truth for 56 years. On March 14, 2024, the FBI and Louisiana police officially arrested Pastor David LeMay in Donaldsonville. He was not charged with abduction, statute of limitations expired, but with concealing a federal crime. obstructing justice, participating in illegal paperwork through an intermediary, failing to report a crime involving a child. As the handcuffs clicked, he said only one thing: "I thought it was God's will." Emily stood watching, ice running through her veins. No, it was the will of people who used God to kidnap my brother. But the FBI knew LeMay was not the final link. He was the one who opened the door for Marcus to leave the family. The woman who called Marcus out was the second link, and the wet-shirted man from Ohio was the center of the entire network. And at the end of the interview, LeMay added one sentence that stopped the FBI cold: "I never knew his real name. We just called him the carrier." A title, not a person's name. A role in the system. And that was the door to the darkest part of the case, something no one in 1967 could have imagined. The federal courthouse in the Eastern District of Louisiana was packed on the morning of August 18, 2024. Microphones pointed straight at the main doors, rows of reporters jostled for shots, and inside was a hearing, unlike any in the history of child crime cases, a 58-year-old abduction, now retried with the victim himself present. On the witness bench, Marcus Hill, the man who had lived his entire life as Mark Hastings, sat shoulder to shoulder with his sister Emily. Their hands were locked together, as if making up for 58 years of being pulled to opposite sides of America. The defendants that day were not the actual abductors, most were long dead, but the two people most deeply involved in concealing the truth: Marjorie Cole, creator of the fake birth certificate; Pastor David LeMay, for deliberately providing false information and covering up the child trafficking pipeline. But the trial was not just about assigning guilt, it was the final event to rip open why Marcus Hill was taken, who knew what, and who deliberately buried the truth for 58 years. Emily testifies, a truth silenced for half a century. When called to the stand, Emily looked straight at the jury, no shaking, no backing down, only a deep pain that made her voice catch. "I grew up with one photograph, my brother standing by the back door, holding a tin boat. I looked at that picture every day, and wondered why my family was the only one still searching for him." She recounted her mother's letter, the woman's voice calling Marcus, the sound of running footsteps, the feeling that someone was always watching. Emily said, "My mother suspected Pastor LeMay, but she was afraid to speak." In Donaldsonville in 1967, who dared suspect the pastor? The entire courtroom fell silent. Marcus takes the stand, and the entire court stopped breathing. Marcus walked to the witness box with an FBI agent's support. No one in the room had ever seen a case where the abducted child testified nearly 6 decades later. Marcus spoke slowly but firmly. "I don't remember everything, but I remember a wooden house near the swamp. I remember a woman carrying me, running through dark water." He pointed at LeMay. "And I remember your voice, not from the night I was taken, but from the sermon afterward." LeMay bowed his head, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus continued, "I heard you say, some children are sent by God to other places. I didn't understand it as a child, but now I know, you were talking about me." Someone in the gallery started crying. Marjorie Cole's testimony, the truth about the night Price received Marcus. Marjorie Cole was helped to the stand. She trembled but spoke clearly. "I created a fake birth certificate. I am ashamed, but Price did not abduct the child. He received him from a man soaked in water, clothes caked in mud. That man was shaking like he had run through the whole swamp." Marcus lowered his head. His memories matched perfectly. Cold water, the smell of black mud, the man's hand on his shoulder, the words, "Don't let him go back there." Mrs. Cole went on, "They told me not to use the child's real name, and to finish the paperwork immediately." The prosecutor asked, "Do you believe the child was sold?" Marjorie choked back tears. "I didn't dare believe it then, but today, yes, I believe he was sold." Emily squeezed Marcus's hand so hard her nails dug into his skin. Pastor LeMay, the final collapse. When LeMay was called, his steps were heavy, as if carrying a lifetime of guilt. He confessed, "I didn't know they would do it. I only thought they were taking the child to a better family." The prosecutor pressed, You said that while knowing Lorraine Hill couldn't eat or sleep searching for her son, when she came to your church begging you for help, LeMay shook. I didn't dare go against them. Who are them? The question rang out. LeMay clenched his fists. A group from up north. They called themselves the Placement Fellowship. The man soaked in water. We called him the Carrier. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The Carrier. The transporter. The central role in the network. Not the pastor. Not Price. Not the woman who called Marcus. But the one who moved children out of Louisiana, across state lines, erasing every trace. The prosecutor asked, "Did you meet the Carrier before the night Marcus disappeared?" LeMay nodded. "He came to me 2 days earlier. He said the boy doesn't belong here. I thought it was a message from God." Emily shot to her feet, screaming through tears. "You let them take my brother because you thought it was God's will." The judge had to bang the gavel for order. Surprise witness, Deputy O'Rourke, the truth buried since 1967. Just when the trial seemed to have revealed everything, the prosecution called its final witness, Deputy Michael O'Rourke, now 81, one of the first officers at the Hill House the night Marcus vanished. He walked to the stand with a cane, eyes red. "I have something to say before I die." The room froze. O'Rourke testified, 3 weeks before Marcus disappeared, I saw someone standing in the dark beside the Hill House, a tall man with dark hair. I thought he was watching Lorraine. Emily's mouth fell open. Marcus slowly turned to her. O'Rourke continued, "I reported it to my superiors, but they told me don't stir anything up. They said he was just a passerby." The prosecutor asked, "Why didn't you say this in 1967? He lowered his head, "Because the sheriff told me to stay quiet." He said, "Don't go making trouble with the pastor or the pastor's friends." Emily felt her heart turn to ice. Marcus gripped her hand. "Mom was right. They were watching our family before I vanished." The judge looked down, expression grave. A deputy silenced for 58 years. To protect whom? Court conclusion, a truth no one can deny any longer. In the end, the federal prosecutor announced, Marjorie Cole guilty of federal document fraud, sentenced to 4 years suspended. Buster LeMay guilty of concealing information and obstruction of justice, sentenced 6-10 years. But more importantly, the court recorded the following findings. 1. Marcus Hill was abducted by design, not lost. 2. An intermediary organization was involved in child transfer. 3. The Carrier, primary suspect, originated from the north, identity still unknown. 4. Lorraine Hill was under surveillance before the abduction. Emily hugged Marcus in tears, as the judge declared, court acknowledges Marcus Hill was taken, not by fate, not by mistake, but by human hands and human decisions. And today, this court restores your name, your identity, and your truth. But the trial left one huge question unanswered. Who was the woman who called Marcus? LeMay handled paperwork. No. Price received the child, not the abductor. The Carrier transported, possibly, but he was not the one who called Marcus. One link still missing, the woman whose voice Lorraine heard that night. And when Marcus, in deeper therapy, unlocked one more memory, he said a sentence that took the FBI's breath away. I remember the perfume, a scent I used to smell in church. The entire team understood, the ring was not over. A woman, very close to the Hill family, still in the shadows. When the trial closed the final door on the truth, Louisiana felt as if it had just lived through a spiritual earthquake that had lasted 6 decades. A child erased from history in 1967, now walked into the light with silver hair, deep-set eyes, yet still carrying the innocence of the boy who had once been the center of an entire community's despair. Marcus's story did not just break a family's silence, it shattered an iron door that had kept Louisiana from facing a bitter truth. In the turbulent 1960s, poor Southern children disappeared in silence. No one asked questions, no one dared suspect, and no law protected them strongly enough. And now everyone had to face it. Openly, forcefully. Without evasion, the media exploded. Marcus rescued, or stolen for an entire lifetime. Immediately after the trial, national headlines exploded in unison. The boy who returned after 58 years. Louisiana's longest cold case is no longer cold, stolen or saved. The ethics of a life rewritten. On television, two opposing views erupted fiercely. The Marcus was saved from poverty view sparking outrage. Some conservative commentators said, Marcus was raised in a more stable home. Maybe that was better for his future. But that stance instantly became the center of fury, because it amounted to justifying the abduction of poor children, treating poverty as sufficient reason to tear a family apart. Emily responded in an interview, "If a poor child can be taken and be called saved, then we have all lost our conscience." Her words were shared millions of times. The opposing view, Marcus had a lifetime stolen, and Louisiana must apologize. A coalition of historians, lawyers, and community activists took a firm stand. Marcus was not saved. He was stolen, taken from his mother, his sister, his real name. Not a single day did Marcus live without missing a part of himself. They demanded that the state of Louisiana issue an official apology, create a cold case child oversight fund, reopen investigations into disappearances from 1950, 1975, audit the private adoption system of that era. The debate spread nationwide, becoming fodder for talk shows, podcasts, public radio, and even national forums on children's rights. Emily faced the spotlight, and pain that never lessened. Though she wanted to shield her brother from the media, Emily could not avoid it. She said, "I found him, but I can't give him back his childhood. I can't give back the 58 years my mother cried." Marcus, now an older man, stood beside his sister, eyes on the floor. "I'm grateful for the life I had. But, I wish I had known my mother. I wish she had known I was alive." That statement, broadcast across Louisiana, brought thousands to tears. Louisiana Awakens, Missing Child Reporting System under review. The Marcus case opened a door many law enforcement agencies never wanted to touch. The weakness and bias in 20th century Louisiana missing child procedures. In 1967, no Amber Alert, no federal reporting system. Police could decide on their own that a child wandered off. Evidence was stored haphazardly. Mutual, people were deemed above suspicion if they were clergy or held social standing. After Marcus, the Louisiana legislature held emergency sessions, full reform of all pre-1980 missing person files, creation of the Historical Child Abduction Oversight Commission, mandatory re-examination of 127 unexplained child disappearances, statewide expanded DNA testing for victim families. The media called it the Lafayette, Baton Rouge Awakening, a statewide reckoning. Donaldsonville, the small town facing an unavoidable truth. The people of Donaldsonville, who once avoided the Marcus Hill story out of fear of the past, now had to confront painful realities. A respected pastor helped cover it up. A broken legal system protected the wrong people, a family torn apart with no one held accountable, and an entire town that stayed silent too long. At a memorial for Lorraine Hill on the St. Francis Church lawn, they played an old recording of her voice, "I will search for my son, until the day I stop breathing." That day the entire congregation stood. No one could remain seated before the grief of a forgotten mother. The aftershock spread like a long-delayed prayer. Cultural shift in the community. No more silence. After the Marcus case, Louisiana parents began to act, demanding schools teach safety skills, forming neighborhood watch groups, supervising children after church services, creating child emergency hotlines, sharing old missing child files on social media. A woman in Lafayette said, "If Lorraine had had these things in 1967, Marcus would never have vanished." People no longer saw disappearances as fate, but as something preventable. Marcus, survivor, but not victor. Marcus always refused to be called a miracle child. In a special PBS interview, he said, "I am not a miracle, I am a lesson." When the host asked, "Do you think you were saved or stolen?" Marcus looked straight into the camera, Sudden. I was kept alive, but no one has the right to call that saved. I was taken from my family. I was stripped of my name, my memories, my mother. I lived, but never whole. Louisiana faces a new promise. No second Marcus. The governor declared, no child in Louisiana will ever again be abandoned by the system or lost behind the shield of religion or charity. In October 2024, a new law was signed. Mandatory immediate investigation of every missing child report, no wandered off conclusion, without full search, files stored to federal standards, harsh criminal penalties for any illegal private adoption paperwork. Emily said, that is what my mother fought for her whole life without knowing its name. Both Marcus and Emily were invited to the State Advisory Board to help shape child protection policies, but the deepest aftershock was not in legislation. It was in the question that remains open. The community still whispers, missed it, who is the carrier? Who was the woman who called Marcus? How many other children were taken? Louisiana has awakened, but that awakening comes with the pain that the truth is not complete. And in one private conversation, Marcus whispered to Emily, "Sis, I know one day we'll learn his name." Emily took his hand. No darkness can stand after 58 years of light. Marcus came home, but Louisiana, and America itself, are the ones who truly had to change. Marcus stood inside the old house in Donaldsonville, where everything began nearly 6 decades ago. The wooden walls were still the same, weathered and stained by swamp air. The back door, the one left ajar, 58 years earlier, creaked when he touched it, as if speaking again to a memory time could not erase. Emily stood beside him, saying nothing. The two siblings simply listened to the insects, the water of Bayou Lafourche lapping the bank, enough to make that night of disappearance feel like yesterday. There was no mystical sign, no special wind. But when Marcus placed his hand on the doorframe, he felt the invisible weight of his entire life, the years lived under a different name, torn from his family, raised inside a story that was never his, a life written by people who never had to answer for what they did. The question still hanging, as if carved into the house itself, even after all the investigations, the trial, the testimony, and the tearful return, the most important questions remain unanswered. Who first carried Marcus away? Price never claimed to be the abductor. Cole said Price received the child from a shaking man soaked in water. LeMay preached that the child was sent by God. Those scattered pieces do not form a complete portrait. Only one thing is certain. The person who took Marcus that night, the carrier, still lies beneath the Louisiana swamp water, like the bayou itself, swallowing secrets it refuses to give back. What did Lorraine hear that night? In the letter she left Emily, she wrote, "I heard someone call his name. My son did not leave alone." Why did Lorraine never tell anyone? Fear, self-doubt, or because she believed no one would listen anyway? Those who knew Lorraine say that in the years after the disappearance, she would wake suddenly at night and run to the back door as if chasing a voice. But she never said what or whose voice it was. Inside this house, Marcus whispered, "I wish Mom were still here to tell me." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "She did tell you, just not when you could hear it." Why was Marcus handed to Price? This is the question that forced the FBI to reopen the file yet again, even after the case had been officially closed. Price, according to neighbors, brought home a child soaked to the bone. He had no criminal record, not rich, not poor, nothing special, no obvious motive. So why was he the one handed Marcus? Marjorie Cole said, Price did not abduct. He only received a child from someone who wanted to disappear. That statement opened more theories than it answered. What was that person running from? Trying to protect Marcus, or remove him from somewhere? And why choose an almost total stranger to hand a 7-year-old child to? No answer felt solid. Every name from the original file is dead. Everyone directly involved took their secrets to the grave. The investigation ended, but the truth did not. LeMay was convicted of concealment, not abduction. Cole was charged with forging of birth records. The 1967 police were criticized for negligence, but no one faced court. In the final report, the FBI wrote, Marcus Hill survived, but the exact nature of the 1967 abduction will never be fully determined. That is a rare conclusion in federal files, an admission that some secrets cannot be recovered, not from lack of ability, but because they were deliberately buried. Many experts believe the Marcus case may involve NIA's illegal adoptions of the 1960s, criminal activity moving through Louisiana waterways, or a psychologically disturbed individual protecting children in a twisted way. But all are only theories. Marcus, existing between two lives, standing on the back porch, Marcus looked down at the old boards, where the feet of a 7-year-old boy once ran before vanishing into the night. He said to Emily, "I remember this house, but not my childhood. There is no pain quite like it. Not murdered, not tortured, not imprisoned, but severed from himself. A form of loss no court can quantify." And Emily, who lived her whole life in the shadow of a brother presumed dead, replied, "I found you, but you're the one who has to find yourself again." Two people stood there, both family and strangers, trying to piece together a story torn apart since 1967. The house was silent, but the story kept breathing. When Marcus stepped into the yard, the sunset burned red across the grass, as if the swamp were slowly swallowing the last light of day. He turned back to look at the back door one more time. No 7-year-old boy stood there anymore. No mother's voice calling. No sound from the night he disappeared. Only an old man, survivor of 58 years, carrying a story that was never fully told. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I came back, but the truth is still out of reach." Emily took his hand, and together they walked off the porch as darkness fell. Night swept over Bayou Lafourche again, quiet, heavy, and deep, just like the last time Marcus saw the Louisiana sky in 1967. 58 years to find a child, and a lifetime to understand what really happened. The Marcus Hill story is not just the tragedy of one family in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. It is a mirror held up to America today, how we treat children, the poor, religious authority, and the justice system. In 1967, a 7-year-old boy stepped out the back door of a house by Bayou Lafourche and vanished. Not by God's will, but because adults decided for him. From Pastor LeMay, with his sermon about children sent by God, to Marjorie Cole signing a fake birth certificate, to Eldon Price accepting a child with no papers, all of them told themselves they were helping, yet the result was that Marcus was robbed of his childhood and his identity. The lesson for America today is this: good intentions can never replace law and transparency. If in any community, a pastor, a doctor, a good person is placed above suspicion, simply because of their position, then children like Marcus will always pay the price. Lorraine heard someone call her son, but never dared report it, afraid to touch the church. Deputy O'Rourke saw a man watching her, but was told by superiors to stay quiet. That is the gap crime slips through: silence, deference, and the mindset of it can't be that bad. Today we have Amber Alerts, DNA, investigative journalism, social media. But if parents don't teach children the right to say, "I don't feel safe," if communities still won't ask questions when adoption paperwork is shady, if we still easily accept the argument, "It was for the child's own good," the way some media debated whether Marcus was saved or robbed of a lifetime, then that tragedy can still repeat. In the end, child safety in America doesn't start in Washington or Baton Rouge. It starts in a community that dares to believe victims, dares to question authority, and dares to say no the first time something feels wrong. If you feel the 58-year journey to find Marcus Hill carries a warning for America today, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cases. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, where we keep opening doors the world thought time had buried forever.